I was skewering lemon pepper chicken on flimsy bamboo sticks when Uncle Dave swaggered onto Mom's patio and announced, at a volume only insecurity can reach, that I was wasting my life. "Yo, frontline hero," he shouted, raising his sweating beer like a trophy. "Still drilling the refund script at Big Box? Good thing the world needs human hold music." Laughter erupted from cousins who wanted a ride in his leased Mustang more than they wanted to spare my feelings. Mom tried to twinkle him quiet, but Dave thrived on spotlights, especially the kind that scorched other people. I forced a smile and jabbed another cube of meat, thinking about hourly pay, past due rent, and the insurance that kept Mom's prescriptions coming. At 22, I had a full share of responsibilities and not much leverage. Dave leaned closer, breath heavy with hops and self-regard. "Seriously, Ev, customer service is a cul-de-sac. You don't turn into the guy who designs the map, you turn into the guy who forgot where he parked." The crowd bubbled at his cleverness. He winked at me like we were co-conspirators in my own humiliation. I swallowed the barbecue smoke whole, bones and all, and promised I would never forget the taste. That night, driving my dented Civic back to the apartment I shared with 2 other broke sons, I replayed the barbecue in high-definition loops. By the 8th replay, anger mutated into blueprint. You can't control where a road ends, I told myself, but you can build something worthy at the end of it, something the people speeding past will slow down to admire. I opened my laptop and pulled the internal job board. If advancement existed, I would stalk it like it owed me money. Dave's contempt didn't spring up at the barbecue. It had roots like weeds. The year before, Mom's Corolla died the same week rent and insulin were both due. I swallowed pride and called him, letting faint hope outrun common sense. He answered on speaker, the background hum of a steakhouse where he was toasting quarter-end commissions. I laid out the ask. Could he co-sign a $3,000 credit union loan so Mom could keep her dialysis tech job? He laughed, one of those deep, indulgent laughs that signals to everyone at the table that the punchline just walked in. Then he said, "If I co-sign for every underachiever, how will they ever learn to swim?" Glasses clinked, somebody cheered, and the line went dead. Mom solved the problem by stringing together rides from coworkers and a church van, but something in me calcified that night. Pride says keep receipts. Hunger says cash them in later. The next morning, I printed a photo of Dave at a family reunion, gold watch lifted, victory grin wide, and taped it inside my locker. Every time a caller screamed at me, I stared at that grin and remembered the sound of his laugh and the smell of expensive meat I couldn't afford. Big Box Corp was unapologetic retail sprawl. Electronics, groceries, home improvement, pet vitamins. Every tangent of consumer need jammed under one digital roof. Our support center answered questions about all of it, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. I started at Tier 1, headset glued to my head, listening to customers threaten legal action because a blender arrived with the wrong color lid. Instead of drowning in their outrage, I dissected it. I logged patterns in a spreadsheet, flagged policy choke points, and memorized which supervisors hunted solutions rather than scapegoats. The call that convinced me I could outrun the headset began like any other Tuesday. A father in Milwaukee had ordered a trampoline for his daughter's 6th birthday, paid extra for overnight delivery, and the box arrived split open with half the springs gone. I launched into the script. Empathy, verification, replacement order. He didn't want procedure, he wanted a miracle. When I couldn't conjure one, he accused me of demolishing a child's only birthday wish. His voice climbed into ragged sobs so raw I instinctively lowered mine, letting the silence between us breathe. Without thinking, I toggled to an internal screen most agents never touch, rerouted a pallet from a store 60 miles away, comped same-day courier service, and emailed him a personalized assembly guide I built on my lunch break. 10 minutes after we hung up, my supervisor marched over. I braced for reprimand. Instead, she asked how I'd executed the transfer and whether I could demo it for the training team. That was the moment I realized my true job wasn't answering calls. It was finding cracks in the map and pouring concrete before anyone else noticed. If I could turn customer tiers into a repeatable process, maybe the cul-de-sac had hidden driveways. Pay still lagged bills, but momentum now tilted in my favor. I enrolled in an online business analytics program using the company's tuition reimbursement. Days were headsets and heat maps. Nights were statistics, lectures whispered through cheap earbuds so I wouldn't wake Mom on the couch we pretended was temporary. 3 years blurred like that. Then I presented a data model showing the exact cost of forcing every angry customer through 4 authentication steps. The vice president liked the math, cut 1 unnecessary step, and mailed me a bonus check that felt like a passport stamp into adulthood. My new reputation as the trampoline guy landed me a sit-down with Claudia Perez. a senior manager who read metrics the way cardiologists read EKGs. She called me into a glass cube overlooking the call floor and slid a color-coded heat map across the desk. "Show me where you'd cauterize," she said. I traced clusters of repeat calls, proposed a self-service tracking portal, and outlined a phased rollout using the routing logic I'd hacked from Milwaukee Dad. Claudia listened, silver pen tapping in rhythm with my sentences. When I finished, she asked how soon I could build a prototype. "It's running on my laptop," I answered. 2 weeks later, I presented that prototype to directors. 4 weeks after that, I was promoted to process improvement specialist, my first salaried role with benefits strong enough to move Mom off the living room couch and into her own bedroom. Claudia became mentor, sponsor, occasional drill sergeant. She taught me every executive speaks 2 dialects, money and risk, and that my value would scale in proportion to how fluently I translated frontline chaos into those dialects. The headset went in a drawer, but the blueprint I'd sworn to build grew wings. Family gatherings became less painful after that, not because Dave changed, but because his words slid off new armor. He still bragged about client golf trips and called people who worked wage job civilians, yet subtle cracks formed. His stories about commission windfalls sounded recycled. The roar of the market had started to taper, and he didn't have fresh highlight reels. Meanwhile, my title lined up consonants: senior analyst, then manager of workforce strategy. Nobody outside Big Box knew what those meant, but Dave's eyes twitched each time another syllable appeared on my badge. As the portal rolled out, I noticed new hires struggling with the math behind our forecasts. They could handle scripts, but froze when heat maps shifted. Claudia challenged me to teach what you needed 5 years ago, so I built a crash course workshop called Metrics Made Human. I stripped the jargon, used Trampoline Dad as a case study, and made participants calculate the cost of a single ruined birthday versus a proactive routing fix. The pilot ran at 7 on a Saturday. Voluntary, free bagels. 20 agents showed up. 18 completed the post-test high enough to graduate straight to Tier 2. The program became mandatory within a quarter, and soon I was running a miniature academy inside Big Box, churning out analysts who thought in dollars instead of drama. The irony wasn't lost on me. The kid accused of aiming low was now authoring the company's ladder. Mom sat in the back at the first graduation, clapping hardest. Later she whispered, "Dead ends are perspective, not geography." I wrote that on the whiteboard for the next cohort and never erased it. At 29, I flew to headquarters to interview for Director of Customer Excellence Analytics. The lobby smelled like coffee and purpose. During the presentation, I quoted frontline agents by first name. Executives leaned in. When I landed the role, HR mailed me a badge with gold edging. I drove home that weekend, flashed it at Dave across Grandpa's dining table, and watched his smile freeze. "You running reports for the big guys now?" he asked. "Designing them," I answered. He lifted his beer. "Cute, keep grinding." A younger version of me might have bristled. This version just noted the brittleness in his eyes. 2 years later, the brittle shattered. Automation hit Dave's industry like a meteor. Leasing reps were suddenly unnecessary when an AI platform could bundle equipment and financing with a click. His company downsized hard. 60% of sales staff were gone by Thanksgiving. Dave updated LinkedIn daily, posted hustle memes, chased leads that evaporated mid-email. Family chat filled with sideways condolences. I observed quietly, karma doesn't need a hype man. Then, on a brisk Tuesday, I almost missed because of budget reviews. Our recruiter slacked me. Prospect with the deep sales ops background applying for Customer Excellence Optimization Manager. Wants your org? Mind glancing? I opened the resume. David Markham. The text blurred as memory overlaid reality. The beer, the barbecue, the cul-de-sac jab. The position he wanted reported directly to me. Company rules required a 3-person interview panel. Hiring manager, peer director, HR partner. Once Dave's resume hit my inbox, I spent 2 evenings doing due diligence I'd do for any candidate, just with extra caffeine. I pulled his public sales figures, compared his claimed achievements against SEC filings of his former employer, and noted a generous rounding habit. I reread the company's nepotism policy twice, highlighting the clause about potential conflicts. Influence cuts 2 ways, so I documented every step, date-stamped and shared with HR. I built a competency matrix: SQL fluency, lean mindset, empathy quotient. For each item, I drafted scenario questions that, answered well, would impress any panelist. If Dave was as sharp as he bragged, he'd shine. If not, he'd sink by his own ballast. The night before the interview, I clicked through old photos, stopping on the barbecue snapshot. Dave in glossed sunglasses, lips pursed mid-quip. Everyone else mid-laugh. I didn't feel anger. I felt clarity. Revenge wasn't a dagger. It was a spotlight under corporate lighting, impartial and bright. I booked the earliest slot. Interview day arrived. I chose the navy blazer Mom bought after my first promotion and checked every button. The conference room smelled like dry erase markers and new carpet. Kara from HR set up the competency matrix. Luis, our sister team director, adjusted the ring light because Dave would join remote. When his face flickered on screen, he opened with the salesman handshake gesture, both hands slightly raised as if greeting old buddies. Recognition pulsed behind his eyes. "Evan, long time, cousin." I smiled politely. "Let's get started, Mr. Markham." Kara ran behavioral questions. Dave wielded buzzwords like duct tape, wrapping every answer in synergy, value add, world class. Luis probed data governance. Dave pivoted to anecdotes about relationship selling. Skepticism brewed. My turn. I shared a document on screen. A swim lane diagram of our return authorization workflow. The same one his barbecue joke once targeted. I asked him to redesign it live, defining stakeholders, metrics, projected ROI. He stammered, blamed screen resolution, asked for context already in the legend. 5 silent minutes later, he suggested adding white glove escalation, a phrase meaning nothing without structure. I nodded and handed control back to Kara. 45 minutes after the call ended, the 3 of us debriefed. Kara flagged gaps in technical depth. Luis worried he'd undermine analysts by selling vapor. Both recommended rejection. I documented their points, added that his skill set skewed legacy, and signed off. No emotion, just policy. Dave beat HR's rejection email by calling that evening. I let it buzz. Voicemail. "Hey Ev, quick chat?" I archived it. Rejection letter went out next morning. 5 minutes later, Dave texted, "Need feedback. Family to family." I typed, "All feedback comes through HR. Best of luck." Bubble ellipses appeared, then vanished. Sunday family Zooms were tradition since Grandma hated typing. During that week's call, Dave kept his camera off. When Grandma logged off, he unmuted. "Evan, sidebar?" The room went silent, half voyeurism, half relief not to be the target. We jumped to a breakout. Dave looked smaller. Lighting, perhaps, but maybe honesty. "I know I bombed," he said. "I can learn. Can you get me a different role? Assistant manager, even senior rep?" Remember calling my career a cul-de-sac? He sighed. That was banter. "Banter stops when only one person laughs," I said. "Your answers lacked data, your strategies were slogans, and your certification list is mostly expired. Hiring you would ask my team to carry weight you haven't trained for." Pain flickered. "You're punishing me. I'm upholding standards you taught me the day you showed me what happens when ego beats preparation." He tried appealing to Mom. "She says forgiveness is strength. Mom also says actions have receipts." He logged off without goodbye. 6 weeks later, he reapplied for a lower analyst position. Resume unchanged except for 3 certificates labeled in progress. The role required immediate autonomy. I marked does not meet minimums, and let the system send a gentle turn down. Family gossip said Dave started delivering office supplies. Good hours, modest pay, no more leased Mustang. Instagram showed a 10-year-old pickup. Mom asked if I was satisfied. I said satisfaction was never the point. Standards were. Whether Dave rose to meet them was up to him. Months passed. We launched an AI agent that shaved resolution time by 12%. My team received stock grants. At a town hall, an agent asked how to stay motivated amid layoffs. I answered that no career is a road. It's the house you build beside it. If you invest in the foundation, it doesn't matter who calls the neighborhood a dead end. That night, an email hit my inbox. Subject: "You win. Body: I was wrong about you. Congrats on your dead end." No signature. I archived it. Revenge fantasies often involve fireworks, public takedowns, soaring theme music. The real thing was quieter, a hiring matrix, an HR template, a gate that stayed locked until the key holder earned entry. Mom's health improved. She started teaching water aerobics 3 times a week. I bought her a reliable hatchback and paid off the last medical bill the barbecue shift couldn't cover. On the anniversary of my first promotion, I hosted a cookout at my house. I grilled chicken again, this time on stainless steel skewers. Family circled the patio under string lights. Dave didn't attend. He was on a delivery route. But his absence didn't leave a hole. Near the end of the night, Cousin Lila asked if I ever thought about the past, about what drove me. I pointed at the house, the laughter, the Slack messages from agents. "I think about doors," I said. "Which ones got slammed, which ones I learned to build, and which ones I'll hold open for people who walk in with respect." I didn't toast to revenge. I toasted to standards, to growth, and to the satisfaction of gates I built myself. Somewhere out in the sprawl, my uncle followed directions I'd already mastered long ago. I knew I was in trouble the moment the envelope slid through the slot in my apartment door. Certified mail at 8 a.m. isn't a love letter. It's the legal version of someone clearing their throat behind you while you're standing at an ATM. I tore it open, half expecting a parking ticket escalation. Instead, I read words that made my coffee taste like battery acid. Complaint for damages, loss of time. My ex, Lisa, actually believed a judge would make me pay her for the years we dated. 4 attachments later, I learned she wanted $46,000 interest and a handwritten apology in blue or black ink. I laughed so hard I scared Mr. Whiskers, my neighbor's cat who visits for treats. Under the shock, though, rage settled in. Low, steady, familiar. Lisa hadn't just scorched earth on the relationship when she disappeared to Cancun with a study group. Now she wanted rent on the ashes. That morning, I decided 2 things. I would fight, and I would make sure the fight ended with the truth nailed to the courtroom wall so clearly, even Lisa's cosmetic laser-polished conscience couldn't ignore it. I hadn't asked for war, but I wasn't surrendering. Lisa and I met 5 years ago in a night class on data visualization. She mocked my color palette. I corrected her axis labels. Sparks flew. We slid into something resembling love during late-night Waffle House runs and binge-watching true crime docs. After 2 years, we split rent on a townhouse, adopted a fern we named Fernie Sanders, and started a joint savings account we called the Adventure Fund. The plan was to backpack Europe when we both finished climbing the corporate ladder enough to afford hostels without flinching. Somewhere in year 3, the dream sprouted hairline cracks. She logged longer hours, hit the gym at dawn, guarded her phone like it contained state secrets. Tyler, a coworker from her marketing agency, appeared in stories and conversations with unnerving frequency. Whenever I asked about him, she'd say, "You're being paranoid." Paranoia that precise is usually diagnosis, not delusion. Confirmation came courtesy of an accidental sync. Lisa had once logged into her Google Photos on our living room Chromecast, and never logged out. One night, mid-Netflix, the screen bloomed with a slideshow labeled Cancun Weekend. There was Lisa, grinning in beach light, clinking glasses with Tyler like tourism advertisements come to life. Date stamps were unambiguous. The same weekend she told me she was attending an out-of-town leadership seminar. I didn't throw anything or scream or beg. I quietly transferred my half of the Adventure Fund into my personal account, drafted a breakup text devoid of adjectives, and left it pinned on the fridge beside the world's saddest bit of fridge poetry. We were. I checked into a motel that night, and by sunrise changed every password I owned. Lisa didn't contest the breakup at first. She posted inspirational quotes about self-growth and told mutual friends we'd grown apart. I moved back into the studio apartment I'd had in grad school, reclaimed Fernie Sanders, and concentrated on rebuilding a life that didn't auto-populate with her shadow. 2 months passed in relative silence. Then came the envelope. The suit was audacious even by influencer-era standards. She alleged that I had stolen 3 years, 6 months, and 14 days of her prime dating life, quantifying each month at the average local salary for a marketing coordinator plus emotional wear and tear. The filing cited obscure articles about palimony, and one definitely misquoted psychologist. It read less like jurisprudence and more like a GoFundMe pitch run through a thesaurus. Before I called a lawyer, I called Jenna, one of Lisa's college roommates, and the closest thing our friend circle has to an archivist. Jenna had quietly screenshotted every story Lisa posted from that Cancun getaway, partly out of aesthetic envy, and partly because her Wi-Fi was down and it was the only entertainment available. The shots were still sitting in cloud storage, date-stamped, GPS-tagged, and way too intimate to pass as class trip photos. Tyler had his arm around Lisa's waist in nearly every frame. They shared towels, cocktails, snorkels. In one picture, they kissed under tiki torches, while a mariachi band blurred in the background. I downloaded the entire cache and bought enough photo paper to keep Staples afloat for a quarter. The next 72 hours were a montage of printer jams, highlighter fumes, and playlist loops of petty revenge anthems. Each photo went into a binder with its metadata enlarged underneath like courtroom subtitles. I pulled bank statements to show the debit card transactions Lisa made from our Adventure Fund on the exact days I received texts about mandatory overtime. Uber receipts she left in my email account filled in the gaps. I even requested customer service chat logs from the resort, proving she had ordered the honeymoon package. By Monday, my kitchen looked like a crime drama evidence board minus the chalk outline. Mr. Carson came recommended by a coworker who swore the man could teach wolves to plead guilty. He was bald, precise, and amused. After flipping through the binder, he said, "This is less a defense and more a guided tour." Carson drafted a counterclaim for legal fees and filed an anti-SLAPP motion, arguing Lisa's suit was frivolous punishment for protected speech, that speech being the breakup text, which, in his words, expressed an opinion on the relationship's viability. We served Lisa through her attorney. She responded by subtweeting about misogynistic gatekeeping of emotional labor. Waiting for the hearing would have been nerve-grinding if Lisa hadn't insisted on broadcasting every grievance like a live-streamed diary. She posted countdowns to court day, shared clips of herself practicing courtroom walks, and even started a TikTok series called Litigate with Lisa. Episode 1 featured her explaining sunk cost fallacy while applying contour. Comments were savage. Strangers asked whether Tyler's sunburn counted as a write-off. She blocked anyone who mentioned me, which had the paradoxical effect of making my name trend in her circle. The courthouse smelled like old paper and stronger coffee. Lisa arrived in a white pantsuit that blinded fluorescent lights. Tyler followed a step behind, carrying her stack of color-coded folders. I took a seat where I could watch the clerk's clock. Petty, but I enjoyed knowing Lisa was paying by the hour for her attorney's time. Judge Bernstein, gray bun tight enough to tune, opened proceedings by asking Lisa's counsel to clarify the legal basis for lost time. The lawyer launched into a monologue about relational investment, citing zero precedent newer than 1983. Bernstein nodded once and said, "So, no actual statute." Carson stood like someone about to unveil a magic trick. He handed the bailiff Exhibit A, the Cancun binder. Bernstein flipped pages with the same expression she might use to sort recycling. "Timestamp, timestamp, timestamp," she muttered. At photo 12, her eyebrows rose. Photo 15, she turned the binder so opposing counsel could see. Lisa's complexion went from bronze to printer paper white. The judge rested a finger on the honeymoon banner. "Ms. Davenport," she said, "were you exclusive with Mr. Randall on this date?" Lisa opened her mouth, closed it, glanced at Tyler. The courtroom's ventilation hummed louder than her answer. Her lawyer objected on relevance. Bernstein overruled, noting credibility was foundational to damages. In under 10 minutes, the complaint was dismissed with prejudice. My counterclaim for costs sailed through unopposed. Bernstein signed the order, looked at Lisa and said, "Court is not a venue for heartbreak." The gavel crack felt like a bell tolling for her dignity. Outside, Lisa cornered me by the vending machines. "You made me look stupid," she hissed. I picked C6, watched a root beer spiral down. "You did the choreography," I said. Tyler puffed his chest until a deputy drifted closer. He deflated, muttering something about parking tickets. I left them with the hiss of the soda can tab as punctuation. That night, I posted a write-up to Aham Shah Pro Revenge, because Catharsis loves an audience. I redacted names and attached scans of the exhibits with black bars over anything identifying. The story detonated. Overnight, I woke to 76,000 upvotes, awards I didn't know existed, and 10 invitations to appear on relationship podcasts. Internet sleuths, however, are bloodhounds on espresso, and someone cross-referenced Lisa's TikTok outfits with the courtroom video feed local news had aired. By noon, her comment sections were a wildfire of laughing emojis. But online embarrassment was only the opening act. A recruiter friend for a mid-size agency messaged me, "Didn't you date Lisa Davenport? She just applied here." Human Resources, doing routine due diligence, ran her name through public court filings and found the dismissal. They also found the Reddit thread because the first page of Google did. The hiring committee flagged the case under professional judgment concerns and moved on. Similar stories trickled in from 2 other firms. Marketing, it turns out, cares about optics. Tyler didn't escape collateral damage. His company had a strict fraternization policy. Dating within client teams required disclosure. Someone sent HR a tip with a link to the TikTok series and the court order, demonstrating he'd been romantically involved with a colleague on a trip billed to a client. He wasn't fired, but he was reassigned to an internal role with no travel and plenty of spreadsheet cleanup. Sources say his sunburn faded long before his resentment. 3 weeks later, a certified check for $2,843 arrived, my costs plus interest. I deposited it, pulled the equivalent cash in 50s, and bought myself the ergonomic office chair I'd been eyeing since the breakup. The rest I donated to a nonprofit that funds legal aid for tenants. I emailed Lisa the receipt with the subject line, "Time well spent." She didn't reply. People ask whether I feel guilty. Guilt implies I wronged her. All I did was present reality with good lighting and a tasteful soundtrack. If exposure hurts, maybe wear sunscreen next time. I've learned courtrooms don't fix broken hearts, but they do quantify nonsense. Lisa tried to attach a price tag to regret. The market responded with a clearance sale. So here's the takeaway for anyone tempted to convert heartbreak into a line item. The legal system is slow, expensive, and allergic to drama. If you want therapy, hire a therapist. If you want money, get a job. If you want revenge, remember that truth ages better than spray tan and screenshots outlive denial. I didn't forgive Lisa because forgiveness is a gift, and you don't hand gifts to someone still swinging a bat. I chose closure instead. Closure framed above the espresso machine where every morning it whispers, "Some debts pay themselves." Fernie Sanders is thriving on the kitchen windowsill. I'm planning a solo trip to Europe next spring, funded not by Adventure Fund 1.0, but by overtime I actually worked. When I go, I'll visit the Prado, eat street kebabs at midnight, maybe finally learn to pronounce Gaudi correctly. And if a stranger on a hostel bunk asks about past relationships, I'll shrug and say, "Once, someone tried to charge me for time lost. I settled the bill." Preparation became my second job. I learned how to download EXIF data, how to batch convert HEIC files, and which county clerk accepted exhibits on USB versus CD. I called the resort pretending to be a honeymoon guest, who lost the welcome email and coaxed a copy of the itinerary from a tired front desk agent. It included a couple's snorkeling excursion at 1 p.m. Saturday, overlapping perfectly with the timestamp on a selfie where Lisa captioned her margarita working lunch. I drove to a notary at a shipping store, so every screenshot came with a sworn statement of authenticity. By the end, I had a chain of custody that would satisfy CSI villains. Did the process stress me out? Absolutely. I lost 8 pounds I didn't need to lose and developed an intimate relationship with Anisid's. Nights were worst. I'd stare at the ceiling replaying arguments we'd had about chores, wondering when those conversations turned into exhibits in her head. But every 3 a.m. spiral ended the same way. I pictured that slideshow on a courtroom screen and felt adrenal calm. Revenge can be ugly, yet discipline makes it symmetrical. A week before trial, Lisa's lawyer floated a settlement. If I paid 10 grand and issued a public apology, they'd drop the suit. The email dripped with faux magnanimity, like they were offering me early bird pricing. Carson replied with 2 sentences. "My client declines. We are prepared to proceed." I forwarded the exchange to Jenna, who replied with the popcorn emoji. Trial day proper felt like a theater production. The gallery contained exactly 9 spectators. 3 curious law students, Carson's paralegal, Tyler's coworker, who looked both bored and terrified, and 4 of my friends who called themselves the Peanut Gallery. Lisa testified first, painting our relationship as a cage built from my insecurities. Carson let her speak uninterrupted for 12 minutes, let her describe missed career opportunities and vacations allegedly canceled because of me. Then he asked one question. "Did you take a trip to Cancun on July 17th last year?" Lisa's lawyer objected. The judge overruled. Lisa said it was a professional development retreat. Carson produced the resort itinerary, highlighting the couple's massage. Tyler's face went crimson. The students scribbled furiously. Next came my turn on the stand. Carson led me through our timeline, establishing joint finances and cohabitation, but also my lack of any promise of marriage. Opposing counsel tried to frame my breakup text as emotional abandonment. Carson introduced the screenshot of Lisa's Instagram story posted 3 hours before my breakup text showing her and Tyler in a hot tub. The tension in the room shifted from curiosity to dread, the kind you feel before an elevator cable snaps. Our last witness was unexpected. A digital forensics consultant, Carson, hired for 1 billable hour to verify the metadata. He explained for the record how geotags, time zones, and device IDs confirmed Lisa's presence at the resort. He spoke calmly, like explaining weather to toddlers. The judge asked one question. "Can these be faked?" He answered, "Yes, but it would take more effort than simply not lying." The courtroom chuckle was small but lethal. After closing arguments, Bernstein called a recess. I paced the hallway, adrenaline fizzing. Lisa sat on a bench scrolling her phone so aggressively her acrylic nails clicked like castanets. Tyler offered her a bottled water. She ignored him. 20 minutes later, we reconvened for the ruling, the one that pried her complaint off the docket like gum from a shoe. That evening, the Peanut Gallery and I hit McSorley's, the only bar near the courthouse where the floor is stickier than its legal history. We ordered a round of dark ales and toasted to jurisprudence. My phone buzzed with DMs from strangers thanking me for standing up to weaponized heartbreak. I turned it off, savoring analog laughter. Revenge tastes best served on draft. My parents, pragmatic Midwesterners, reacted predictably. Mom mailed me a handwritten card that read, "Proud of you, but please stay out of court from now on." Dad sent a screenshot of Bernstein's order with the caption, "Burn notice issued." They're understated people. This was equivalent to a parade. 2 days later, Tyler messaged me on LinkedIn, claiming I'd ruined his career over a misunderstanding. I replied with a single Google Drive link containing the full exhibit binder. He unsent his message within minutes. Silence is its own settlement agreement. Lisa launched a damage control podcast titled Redefining Regrets, where she interviewed jilted lovers on finding empowerment. Episode 2 featured her discussing narcissistic vampires. Listeners noted the irony that she spent half the show explaining the legal concept of emotional back pay without once mentioning the dismissal. Reviews were brutal. The podcast quietly stopped uploading after 4 episodes. People on Reddit asked about my legal bill. Carson worked on a hybrid fee, retainer plus contingency on the cost award. Total damage to my wallet before reimbursement was $3,200. The settlement check left me net positive by $357, which I immediately spent on the chair and a giant burrito. Justice sometimes comes with guac. Fairness isn't cosmic, it's contractual. Lisa broke a silent contract that said, "Be honest and don't litigate your bad decisions." I enforced it with receipts. Simple. People romanticize forgiveness as though letting go magically repairs damage. I believe in closure, not absolution. Forgiveness might be noble, but revenge, done surgically, prevents repeats. Planning Europe solo has been liberating. I booked hostels in Lisbon, trains to Madrid, cheap flights to Florence. No shared Pinterest board, no obligatory sunset selfies. I'll pack light, clothes, camera, and a manila envelope labeled, "In case of future nonsense," containing USB copies of every exhibit. Not paranoia, experience. If you've read this far, take the moral you need. Maybe it's keep screenshots. Maybe it's don't date people who treat time as a refundable deposit. For me, it's simple. The past only costs you if you buy it back. I paid nothing, collected interest, and now spend my days on either side of an espresso machine that whispers proof every dawn. Sometimes friends ask whether pursuing the case was worth the sleepless weeks and stomach ulcer diet of crackers and ginger tea. I tell them yes, because identity is compounded interest. Every time you defend it, the rate improves. Had I caved, I'd live in a smaller version of myself, paying psychic rent forever. Instead, I bought square footage. The cost was measurable, the payoff immense. I sleep deeper now. I trust my judgment. And if another envelope ever hits my door, I'll greet it with a welcome mat that says, "Leave receipts." Fear hates paperwork. So, was it worth it? Put it this way. The chair reclines, the past doesn't. Every creak of its backrest sounds like another tiny gavel in my favor each day.
I always considered myself a loyal person, especially when it came to my family. My older brother, Garrett, had been my hero for as long as I could remember. We grew up in a quiet suburb, sharing bunk beds until he moved out for college. He was the charismatic one, the star athlete, the dreamer who made everyone smile. So when he introduced me to his fiancée, Kate, I was thrilled to see him settle down. At the time, I never imagined the tangled mess that would ensue, or that I'd end up exiled from the people I loved most. I remember the first time I noticed something off about Kate. It was the day of my parents' anniversary dinner, a big event to celebrate their 35 years of marriage. Garrett had asked me to drive Kate to the restaurant while he handled some last-minute errands. She spent the entire drive texting someone with a kind of excitement I'd never witnessed before, biting her lip and smiling at her phone. When I jokingly asked if she was messaging Garrett, she blushed and quickly locked the screen. She stammered that it was just a friend, but her eyes said otherwise. Somehow, still, I tried to ignore the nagging feeling in my gut. I wanted my brother to be happy, and I certainly didn't want to accuse his fiancée of anything so serious without evidence. Time passed, and Kate's strange behavior only grew more blatant. She'd disappear during family gatherings, claiming she needed to take important phone calls. She'd slip out of the house whenever Garrett was busy, sometimes returning with excuses about helping a friend in need. Each time, I told myself I was overreacting, even though every fiber of my being screamed that something was terribly wrong. I kept waiting. Everything changed during Garrett's bachelor party weekend, 2 weeks before the wedding. He and his friends went to a cabin upstate for fishing and hiking, while I stayed behind to coordinate a surprise slideshow for the rehearsal dinner. Kate claimed she was going to visit her sister. Instead, I saw her slipping into a local cafe with a man I didn't recognize. My curiosity spiked, so I followed them, feeling like an amateur detective. They sat in a corner booth, and the man leaned in too close. When their fingers intertwined, I knew this wasn't just a friendly meeting. Period. I considered confronting her right then and there, but something held me back. Maybe it was fear of causing a public scene, or maybe I worried I'd lose my cool. Instead, I snapped a few discreet photos on my phone. My heart raced as I watched them whisper and share private smiles. It was no fleeting fling. They looked comfortable, like two people who had shared many stolen moments before. When Kate finally stood, hugging the man so intimately, my stomach twisted in disgust. I knew I had all the proof I needed to warn my brother. No more doubts. I returned home, sat in my bedroom, and stared at those damning pictures on my phone. My pulse pounded with equal measures of anger and sadness. How could Kate betray Garrett like this, and why hadn't I noticed sooner? The next day, I decided to tell my parents first, hoping they'd help me break the news gently. My mother looked at the photos in horror, then quickly began rationalizing. She thought maybe Kate was just being friendly, or that these images were taken out of context. My father frowned, clearly disturbed, but also uncertain about what to believe. They hesitated. Confused and upset, I decided it was time to tell Garrett directly. I showed up at his apartment with a heavy heart, explained what I'd witnessed, and handed him my phone. I'll never forget the look on his face, shock, fury, and disbelief mingling in his eyes. For a moment, I thought he believed me. Then, just as quickly, he began demanding explanations. He insisted I must be misunderstanding the situation, or maybe even fabricating the whole thing. My own brother asked if I had staged the photos to sabotage his happiness. The accusation cut deeper than any knife. I recoiled. He told me to leave. Before I did, Kate walked in, eyes red as though she'd been crying. She claimed I was lying, that I must have doctored those pictures somehow. She pretended to be heartbroken over the betrayal of my accusations. Garrett stood there, arms crossed, looking pained and torn. But ultimately, he chose her side. My mother and father insisted I drop it, fearful of ruining the wedding. They wanted peace, not scandal. When I kept insisting, they cut me off completely, telling me I was no longer welcome at the ceremony. I was officially an outcast, devastated. I spent the next few weeks in a blur of betrayal and anger. I considered crashing the wedding just to shout the truth from the rooftops, but ultimately, I decided against it. If my own family refused to trust me, what good would more conflict do? So I stayed home, sick to my stomach, while Garrett married Kate in a lavish ceremony I only saw pictures of online. Those pictures made me feel like a stranger spying on someone else's family. I could see their happy faces, but I knew it was all built on a shaky foundation. None listened. After the wedding, the silence grew. My family stopped calling entirely. On social media, I saw them living life as though I no longer existed. Kate and Garrett posted smiling photos of dinners, holidays, and eventually, the announcement of their first child. Each image stabbed me with a reminder that I'd been unjustly labeled a liar. I buried myself in work, trying to move on. I managed to build a modest career in web design, renting a small apartment far from the memories of my old life. New friends came into my world, but the wounds never fully healed. Ever. Years went by. Sometimes, on lonely nights, I'd think about calling Garrett, but my pride always stopped me. He had made his choice. Then one afternoon, out of the blue, my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. I answered, heart thumping when I realized it was my mother's voice on the line. She sounded older, frailer, as though the years had weighed on her. She hesitated, stumbling over her words, and then finally asked if we could meet. She said it was urgent, something about Garrett's divorce. I felt a strange blend of hope, curiosity, and dread. Unexpected. We agreed to meet at a neutral spot, a cozy cafe in downtown. I arrived first, palms sweating, unsure how this reunion would go. When my mother walked in, I almost didn't recognize her. She looked older than her years, worry etched into the lines on her face. We exchanged an awkward hug, and she asked about my life in halting tones. I could tell she was trying to mend things, but she seemed weighed down by guilt. Finally, I mustered the courage to ask about Garrett and the divorce. She sighed deeply, saying Kate's infidelities had finally come out. I felt a surge of vindication, though it was drowned in sadness. My mother explained that Kate's affair had been discovered a few months ago when Garrett found racy messages on her laptop. It turned out she'd been cheating for years, not just a one-time slip. The man from the cafe? Possibly just one of several. Garrett was devastated, furious, and in the process of a messy divorce. My mother cleared her throat, then said in a shaky voice that Garrett needed my help. He was building a case against Kate to protect his finances and custody of their son. When she mentioned custody, I realized just how high the stakes were. Garrett had a toddler now, a boy named Ethan, and he wanted full custody if possible. The affair evidence mattered. My mother said they needed me to testify about what I'd seen years ago. Immediately, I felt a rush of bitterness. Where was this concern when I first tried to warn them? I told my mother that I felt exploited, like they only wanted me around when it served their interests. She didn't deny it. She just pleaded with me to remember that Garrett was still my brother. I agreed to meet Garrett the following week, if only to hear him out. We chose a quiet diner. He arrived looking haggard, with dark circles under his eyes and a new tension in his jaw. At first, we sat in silence. Then he said he was sorry, that he should have believed me. He admitted he'd been blinded by love and by a stubborn refusal to think his fiancée could do wrong. He spoke about Ethan, how Kate had threatened to move out of state and limit his contact. That fear in his voice was new to me, unsettling. I didn't want to cave so easily. Part of me wanted him to suffer a bit, to understand the years I spent ostracized. But as I looked at my brother, hollowed by heartbreak, I remembered the good times we'd shared. I thought about Ethan, an innocent child caught in the crossfire of adult mistakes. So I told him I would testify. I would show the court the pictures I still had tucked away on an old hard drive. Garrett's sigh of relief was palpable. Still, I felt a pang of anger, wondering if this would truly mend our relationship. Uncertain. In the weeks leading up to the court date, my parents came around, visiting my apartment for the first time. They tried to act as if nothing had happened, chatting about my decor, asking about my job. I didn't have the energy to rehash the past, but I also didn't let them off the hook entirely. I told them I felt betrayed, and they offered lukewarm apologies, blaming stress and hoping to move forward. It was uncomfortable, but a part of me clung to the possibility of reconciliation. I couldn't forget that it had taken a crisis for this moment. The day of the hearing arrived. My stomach churned as I walked into the courthouse. Garrett sat at one table, flanked by his lawyer. Kate was on the other side, looking composed despite the tension. We avoided eye contact. When it was my turn to testify, I stepped forward, palms sweating. I recounted the events from years past, the suspicious behavior, the cafe rendezvous, the photographs. I produced the old pictures, heart pounding as Kate's lawyer tried to discredit me. But the judge seemed to listen intently. Garrett watched me with gratitude shining in his otherwise weary expression. Tense resolution. After my testimony, I walked out into the hallway and slumped against the wall, trying to catch my breath. A moment later, Garrett appeared, tears glistening in his eyes. He thanked me, voice cracking. He reached out, and we embraced for the first time in years. I felt a powerful mix of relief and sadness. Relief because maybe, just maybe, our bond could be salvaged. Sadness because we had lost so many years to mistrust and betrayal. My parents joined us soon after, hesitantly patting my shoulder. They apologized, again, and this time it felt a bit more genuine. Finally, the court battle stretched on for weeks, but my testimony, combined with the digital evidence Garrett uncovered, tipped the scales in his favor. He was awarded primary custody of Ethan, and Kate's lawyer negotiated a settlement that was far less advantageous than she'd hoped. I saw Kate briefly outside the courthouse on the final day. She looked exhausted, her once confident demeanor replaced by a strained expression. We locked eyes for a moment, and I thought I saw a flicker of remorse. Or maybe it was just anger. I turned away, feeling an odd sense of finality settle over me. Done. After the dust settled, Garrett tentatively reached out and asked if I'd like to meet Ethan. He wanted to start bridging the gap we'd created. Despite the lingering pain, I said yes. We met at a park near my old neighborhood. Ethan was a shy, sweet kid with Garrett's eyes. Watching him chase bubbles across the grass, I felt a surge of protectiveness. This little boy had no idea how much chaos had swirled around his existence. Garrett and I made small talk. We didn't address the years of estrangement directly, but there was a wary undercurrent in every word. Over time, Garrett and I found moments to speak honestly about what had happened. He told me he hated himself for not believing me back then. I told him I'd been angry, heartbroken, and still was, to some degree. We tiptoed around the question of whether our relationship could ever return to what it was. Part of me knew it wouldn't, but I also recognized a willingness on both sides to try. My parents made more of an effort too, inviting me to family dinners and gradually acknowledging the rift. Yet, in the background, resentment still flickered like embers, lingering. I sometimes wonder what life would have been like if Garrett had believed me from the start. Would Kate's deception have come out sooner, saving everyone heartbreak and isolation? Or would Garrett have chosen to ignore the truth regardless? Despite everything, I can't help but feel that I lost something irretrievable during those years alone. It's not just the time we missed, it's the sense of familial trust that was shattered. Even now, when my parents hug me or Garrett thanks me for being there, I sense a fragile caution. We're trying to rebuild, but cracks remain. Scars run deep. One night, as I was lying in bed, I got a call from Garrett. He told me he'd found a journal entry Kate had written, detailing her affairs in shocking detail. She'd mentioned me by name, calling me the nosy little sibling who nearly ruined everything. For a split second, I felt a twisted sense of triumph. She had admitted, in her own words, that I'd been right all along, but it also made me sad. Sad that none of this had to happen, and that our family had suffered so deeply for one person's dishonest choices. It hurt anyway. Nowadays, we have a tentative peace. Garrett focuses on being a devoted father, and my parents try to bridge the gaps they once widened. We spend some holidays together, though the atmosphere feels charged with unspoken regrets. There are moments when we laugh, recalling childhood memories, and I catch a glimmer of what we once had. But I can't fully let go of the hurt, not yet. Maybe in time, with patience and understanding, we'll forge a new kind of closeness. Or maybe our family will remain forever changed, haunted by the specter of a betrayal no one would believe. Sometimes, I question my own choices. Should I have confronted Kate more forcefully? Should I have refused to testify after they all but shunned me? Yet, every time I consider those questions, I think of Ethan. In the end, it wasn't just about my pride. It was about protecting an innocent kid from the consequences of his mother's deception. I'd do it again, even knowing the pain it caused me. Maybe that's the truest definition of family, choosing to stand by the people you love, even when they haven't always stood by you. It's complicated, and it hurts. Still, I persist. Lately, Garrett's been talking about moving closer to where I live so Ethan can attend a better school district. He asked if I'd be open to having them over for Sunday barbecues once in a while. I said yes, but a hesitant yes. We've come a long way from the day they labeled me a manipulative liar, but part of me still bristles at the memory. I don't want to punish Garrett forever, yet I can't pretend it never happened. Maybe we'll find a middle ground, something that feels real, if not perfect. Life rarely wraps up neatly, after all. Unresolved. It's strange to think how one chance encounter in a cafe changed everything. If I hadn't followed Kate that day, maybe I would still be in the dark. Or perhaps, someone else would have discovered her secrets eventually. Regardless, the fallout was massive. I lost my family, then regained them under strained circumstances, and I'm still not sure if I should be grateful or resentful. Maybe both. All I can do is move forward piece by piece. I keep those old photos locked away in a safe, a quiet reminder of the moment my life veered off course for years. Everything shifted. I visit my parents on occasion. My mother cooks big meals, as if extra food can fill the chasms left between us. My father tries to distract me with talk of sports, old times, anything but the painful subject we all know lingers. I appreciate the effort, though it feels like a band-aid on a wound that needs stitches. Garrett and I maintain regular contact now, largely for Ethan's sake, and every once in a while, I catch a genuine smile on my brother's face when he sees me, like he remembers that once we were best friends. Once, unbreakable. And so here I stand, caught between bitterness and hope. I don't know what the future holds for my family. Maybe we'll continue to stitch together the fragments, forging a bond that's stronger for all the fractures. Or maybe we'll remain forever tentative, remembering how easily trust can be shattered. But one thing I know, I was right all along, even if no one believed me. And though it hurts that they came to me only when they needed me, I can't deny that a part of me is glad they finally did, if only to see the truth. Ironically, my entitled sisters insisted on renting out my vacation home for profit. When I said no, their husbands broke in. Now they're facing criminal charges. I never could have imagined that I'd one day press criminal charges against my own sisters, yet here I am, sitting in my kitchen and staring at the stillness of the moonlit garden. My stomach tightens whenever I remember how things escalated to this point, but there's no denying that the betrayal feels thicker than blood. I always believed family was supposed to protect you, not break into your property in the dead of night and expect you to turn a blind eye. Now it's all come to a head. My name is Sabrina, and I'm 36 years old. I grew up in a large family in a suburban neighborhood outside Chicago. My parents worked themselves to the bone to ensure that we were well taken care of, but they also believed strongly in personal responsibility. My two younger sisters, Michelle and Allison, seemed to embrace that idea differently than I did. As kids, they would tag along behind me, mimicking my every move. Now, as adults, we stand on opposite sides of a legal battlefield. I inherited a modest vacation home from our late Aunt Nora 3 years ago. It's tucked away in the Adirondacks, perched near a crystalline lake with mesmerizing mountain views. The home itself isn't particularly large or luxurious, but its location makes it feel like paradise. When I first received it, I considered selling it to pay off my student loans, but I decided against it. Aunt Nora had always found joy there, and I wanted to preserve her spirit in some way. For the past few years, I've occasionally visited the cabin for some much-needed solitude. I was never one to invite large groups of friends. I relished the quiet, taking long walks on the trail behind the house or kayaking when the weather allowed. I liked that I didn't need to worry about city noise or deadlines. Some might call it lonely, but I call it peaceful. I firmly believe everyone needs a sanctuary, and this was mine. Michelle and Allison always seemed intrigued by my getaway spot, although not for the same reasons. Michelle once asked if I'd considered renting it out when I wasn't using it. According to her, there was a goldmine in short-term rentals, and I'd be foolish not to cash in. Allison, ever the opportunist, quickly chimed in. She swore that the best way to honor Aunt Nora's memory was to keep the house busy with paying guests. I remained unconvinced. I never minded the idea of sharing the cabin with family. In fact, I was more than willing to let my sisters stay there for free whenever they needed a break. But the notion of letting complete strangers occupy the place, especially after all the personal touches I'd invested, felt wrong to me. Plus, I couldn't shake the sense that Aunt Nora wouldn't have wanted her beloved retreat turned into a commercial enterprise. She'd chosen me because I cherished privacy. At first, my sisters didn't push the matter. They brought up the idea in a casual, offhand manner whenever we met at family gatherings, but never forced a conversation. That was until last summer, when Michelle found herself in a financial bind. Her consulting job ended abruptly, and her husband, Greg, struggled to cover all their expenses alone. Meanwhile, Allison's husband, Robert, saw an opportunity for an additional income stream. Suddenly, they were actively pressuring me to list the cabin online. Throughout last year's 4th of July family barbecue, I was bombarded with well-rehearsed speeches about the property's potential. Greg insisted that it could fetch at least $200 a night, more on holidays. Robert brought up statistics from tourism websites to back up the argument. All the while, Allison hovered nearby, nodding enthusiastically. Michelle, always the bold one, even offered to manage the rentals for me. She painted a rosy picture of how convenient it would be for me. I tried to remain polite but firm. My reluctance wasn't just about money or risk. It was about principle, about preserving something special without monetizing it. Whenever I tried explaining this, they looked at me as if I were speaking a foreign language. They saw a missed opportunity, while I saw a safe haven that deserved peace. The tension grew thicker each time we revisited the conversation, but I naively believed we'd eventually reach an understanding. Things took a turn when Michelle called me out of the blue last October. She said she had a friend with a large family who needed a place to stay over the Christmas holiday. She wanted to offer them my cabin at a discounted rate. Her voice was cheerful, as if she were doing me a favor. I remember pacing in my living room, gripping my phone so tight my knuckles turned white as I struggled to keep my composure. I told her no in the most polite way I could manage, but my voice trembled. I half expected her to argue, but instead, she fell silent. I think she realized then that I was serious, that I wasn't going to be strong-armed into renting out my property. Though the phone call ended courteously enough, I felt a quiver in my gut, telling me that this wasn't over. It was just a matter of time before they tried again. Sure enough, Allison reached out a week later, claiming she was worried about Michelle's financial situation and urging me to help. She repeated the same sales pitch about short-term rentals, weaving it with guilt. She said that as sisters, we should support one another, that I owed them a sense of loyalty. I tried explaining that my decision had nothing to do with lack of empathy. I offered to help Michelle in other ways, like co-signing a small personal loan, but I refused to commercialize the cabin. From that point on, family gatherings turned sour. The tension was palpable during Thanksgiving dinner. My mother noticed the shift but seemed hesitant to intervene. Michelle's eyes had a cold gleam, while Allison looked perpetually disappointed. Greg and Robert barely made eye contact with me. It was as if they'd collectively decided I was the villain for refusing to share potential profits with the family. It hurt me deeply, but I remained resolute in my decision. December rolled around, and I decided to spend Christmas at the cabin alone. I wanted to escape the constant nagging and the guilt trips. I packed my car with enough groceries, a stack of novels, and some new hiking gear. The drive took nearly 6 hours in the snow, but each minute that brought me closer felt like a weight lifting off my shoulders. I needed that distance, that crisp mountain air, to clear my head of all the conflict. On Christmas Eve, as I watched the snow fall over the lake, I felt a pang of loneliness mixed with relief. I yearned for a simpler time when my sisters and I shared everything without ulterior motives, but we were adults with our own tangled complexities. I told myself that perhaps this rift was temporary. The crackling fire and the stillness outside soothed me more than any family gathering could have. For a moment, I felt I'd found peace again. That serenity was shattered 2 days later when I got a phone call from a neighbor who lived half a mile down the road. He informed me that someone had tried to break into my cabin the previous night while I was out on a late hike. Apparently, he'd noticed fresh tire tracks leading up to my driveway and heard some commotion before the intruders fled. My heart dropped to my stomach as I hurriedly drove back to see the damage. I found the back door's lock jimmied and muddy footprints tracked across the porch. There was a broken window near the kitchen, shards of glass glittering on the floor like an accusation. I felt violated, angry, and afraid, all at once. Why would anyone target my quiet little retreat, especially in the middle of winter? The neighbor described 2 men running off, but he hadn't been able to see their faces clearly. A wave of dread washed over me as I called the local sheriff. The sheriff arrived an hour later, and we surveyed the damage together. He said that based on the forced entry, the intruders were likely familiar with the place, since they chose a time when the surrounding cabins were mostly vacant. The thought of someone I knew trying to get in unsettled me, but I wasn't ready to accuse anyone without proof. I asked if there had been similar incidents in the area, but the sheriff shook his head. I cleaned up what I could, replaced the broken window with a temporary board, and decided to drive back home the next day. The vacation I'd hoped would revitalize me ended on a bitter note. As I drove, I found my mind racing with suspicions. Could it have been random burglars hoping to score electronics or valuables? Or was it someone aware of the cabin's significance to me, someone who felt entitled to use it? The possibilities haunted me. Over the next few weeks, Michelle and Allison kept their distance. I mentioned the break-in to them in passing, half expecting shock or concern, but they simply murmured something vague. My mother, on the other hand, was horrified. She insisted I install a security system. While I was rattled, I still didn't want to believe my own relatives would stoop so low. I scheduled the installation of cameras and alarms anyway, hoping it would bring me peace of mind. As winter turned to spring, I tried to put the incident behind me. Work demanded my attention, and life seemed to move forward. But something felt off whenever I spoke to Michelle or Allison. They seemed resentful, as though my refusal had become a personal slight. Their husbands were no more cordial. Greg avoided eye contact whenever we ran into each other, and Robert greeted me with a tight-lipped smile that never reached his eyes. It was a new kind of family tension. By early summer, I decided it was time for another trip to the cabin. This time, I arranged for the security system to be activated well in advance. I also asked my neighbor to keep an extra eye out. I even considered inviting a friend along, but ultimately decided I wanted solitude. The drive was scenic, with lush green hillsides and clear skies. My heart fluttered when I finally turned onto the familiar dirt road leading to my sanctuary. After unlocking the front door, I was relieved to find everything intact. The new security panel blinked reassuringly. I placed my bags in the small bedroom and made myself a cup of tea, trying to soak in the calm I'd missed. The next day, I woke early and took my kayak to the lake. Paddling across the still water reminded me why I fought so hard to keep this place private. It was worth the conflict, I told myself. That evening, I settled on the porch with a book and a blanket. The sun dipped behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the lake. Around 8, I heard a car engine in the distance. My body tensed as headlights flickered through the trees. I flipped on the porch light and walked to the edge of the driveway, my heart pounding. A black SUV pulled up, and the sight of Greg and Robert stepping out made my stomach churn. I approached them cautiously, demanding to know what they were doing here. Greg, looking uneasy, said they'd come to talk. Robert claimed they just wanted to see if I'd reconsider the rental idea, promising me it would help the family. My anger flared, but I tried to remain composed. The audacity of them showing up unannounced, here, of all places, left me speechless. I told them this was inappropriate, that they had no right to barge in on my retreat. They insisted on coming inside, but I refused. I told them we could talk on the porch if they really had to. Greg kept glancing at his phone, and Robert's eyes roved over the cabin as though appraising it. The conversation quickly escalated. They criticized me for hoarding a potential gold mine and questioned why I wouldn't let family benefit. I retorted that my decision was final. Their voices grew louder, the tension thickening with each passing second. Finally, I told them to leave. My voice shook as I said I didn't want them there. Greg scowled, and Robert mumbled something under his breath. They walked back to their SUV, but before leaving, Greg leaned out the window and said, "You're going to regret this, Sabrina." The threat in his tone was undeniable. My hands trembled as I watched the taillights disappear down the driveway. Once inside, I locked every door and window, my mind racing with fear and indignation. I tried to sleep, but found myself checking the security feed on my phone every few minutes. Around midnight, a motion alert startled me. My heart hammered as I tapped the app. Sure enough, Greg and Robert were back, shining flashlights as they walked around the perimeter of my cabin. I quickly called the sheriff's department, hoping they'd arrive before anything happened. My heart pounded with adrenaline, a mixture of terror and rage swirling inside me. Through the camera's feed, I watched them attempt to pry open a window. Their silhouettes were ominous in the dim light, and I could barely breathe as I watched them violate my property. I considered confronting them with my shotgun, which I kept locked away for emergencies, but fear of escalation held me back. Instead, I stayed on the phone with the dispatcher, whispering updates about their location as quietly as I could. Sirens finally pierced the stillness, and the intruders scrambled. Greg tried to get back to the SUV, while Robert bolted toward the woods. The deputies arrived in a flurry of flashing lights. One deputy chased Robert, and another ordered Greg to the ground. Within minutes, both men were in handcuffs, their faces a mix of anger and shame. I watched from the porch, hugging myself for warmth and stability. I was shattered, but also undeniably relieved. The sheriff recognized them from previous community events, which only complicated matters. He approached me, his expression grim, and asked if I wanted to press charges. My initial instinct was to protect my family, but as I looked at my shattered window frame, my ruined sense of security, and remembered their threats, my decision became clear. I nodded, tears stinging my eyes, and told him I would. They had to learn that this was not acceptable, that family ties didn't grant immunity. The next day was a blur of paperwork and phone calls. I called Michelle and Allison to inform them of what happened. Allison burst into tears, claiming she had no idea Robert would go that far. Michelle, however, was furious. She accused me of betraying the family, insisting that Greg was only trying to secure our future. I struggled to find words for the wave of disgust that overcame me. It felt surreal, like a horrifying dream I couldn't wake from. Over the following weeks, the story spread through our extended family like wildfire. I became the outcast, the sister who had turned against her own flesh and blood. Some relatives reached out in solidarity, but most were hesitant, afraid to take sides. My mother was distraught, torn between loyalty to me and sympathy for her other daughters. She urged me to drop the charges. I stood my ground, reasoning that letting them off the hook would only reward their behavior. I hired an attorney to handle the legal intricacies, bracing myself for the backlash. The hearing date arrived faster than I expected. Greg and Robert both showed up in suits, their expressions defiant. My attorney presented the security footage that showed them attempting to break in. The judge seemed unamused by their excuses, which ranged from claiming they had permission to insisting it was all a misunderstanding. It was disheartening to watch them squirm and lie in court. Ultimately, the judge found sufficient evidence for criminal charges, attempted burglary, and trespassing. My sisters sat in the gallery, their faces flushed with fury and embarrassment. On the stand, I felt my voice quake as I recounted the night, but a firm resolve steadied me. I couldn't let them manipulate me again. Though the judge hadn't yet issued a final sentence, there was no doubt that my once happy family had been fractured. I wish I could say I found solace afterward, but the emotional fallout was brutal. Michelle refused to speak to me, and Allison barely managed a strained apology. Both marriages were under immense stress, with mounting legal fees and public scrutiny. I took no pleasure in their suffering, but I couldn't shoulder the blame either. My cabin remained my refuge, its waters and whispering pines reflecting my resolve. My entitled family wants to take my house and hand it over to my brother, even though they threw me out of their home claiming they had no space for me. I was 13 years old when my parents first told me there was no space for me in their home anymore. At that age, I half expected them to be joking. My mother had just cleared out the smaller guest room and filled it with plastic storage containers stuffed with old photos and holiday decorations, while my father muttered something about how cramped the house was becoming. They never explicitly told me to pack my bags that day, but their stance was made heartbreakingly clear. I wasn't as important as their belongings, their collections, and their incessant desire for extra room. Just a few nights after that conversation, I found myself curled up on the sofa in a friend's living room, hugging a tattered pillow I'd dragged along from my former bedroom. I stayed with various friends and, later, found a small place to rent when I turned 18 and had just enough saved from part-time jobs. Whenever I visited my parents, my father would greet me with an awkward handshake, as though I were some kind of distant stranger, and my mother would flick her eyes over my worn-out clothes as if silently judging every wrinkle and stain. Growing up, I'd always been the responsible one. My younger brother, Derek, was a whirlwind of reckless energy. My parents delighted in indulging him while simultaneously scolding me for not being more like him. Derek was the golden child, the one who got the brand new sneakers every school year, the bigger portion at dinner, and the unwavering attention of our extended family. Meanwhile, my duties involved folding laundry, vacuuming rooms, and sometimes even cooking dinner when both of our parents came home late from work. I believed that if I worked hard enough, if I did everything right, they'd finally see me, truly see me. But I remained invisible, overshadowed by Derek's star power. Despite feeling the strain, I kept trying to be helpful. That desire for approval didn't magically disappear when they told me to move out. Instead, I clung to it, convinced that if I showed them I could survive on my own, they might invite me back. In my mind, there was a twisted logic. They must have valued independence, so perhaps they were giving me an early start. Yet, the few times I did see them afterward, it never felt like an invitation. It felt like a courtesy extended by strangers. Things changed when I was 22. By then, I'd put myself through community college, working odd jobs and living in a cramped studio apartment with chipped paint and a leaky faucet. I had a small circle of friends who had become my family of choice, and I spent my weekends flipping through secondhand textbooks, trying to transform each page into a stepping stone toward a better future. One evening, I received a call from my father. His voice, usually strict, sounded shaky and tired. He told me my mother was in the hospital, that she'd had a health scare. Concern overpowered the resentment I harbored toward them, so I rushed to see her. To my surprise, she looked thrilled to see me. She held my hand, tears brimming in her eyes, as she apologized for the misunderstanding that led me to move out. That evening, in that sterile hospital room, I dared to believe that perhaps my mother's brush with mortality had forced her to see me in a new light. My father stood silently on the other side of the bed, his jaw tight, but his gaze less distant than usual. For a fleeting moment, we felt like a family again. That moment of warmth, however, soon dissolved into a pattern I recognized all too well. Derek was there too, breezing in with flowers and extravagant gifts for our mother. My parents marveled at his generosity, and despite my genuine concern, I was once again upstaged. Even in that hospital room, the hierarchy was painfully clear, yet I kept coming back to visit, bringing homemade soup or a funny story in hopes that some part of them would appreciate my efforts. When my mother was discharged, I offered to help her at home during her recovery. My father told me they didn't want to impose, but Derek said, with perfect timing, "Don't be silly, Dad, she's family." I saw something flicker across my father's face before he relented. So, for a month, I was back in that house I'd once called home. I slept on the living room couch, my mother's old crocheted blanket draped over me at night. It was awkward and tense, but there were moments, like when we all laughed over a memory of me and Derek playing hide and seek in the backyard, that made me wonder if this time things might be different. Maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back. But some things never change. Derek, now an ambitious corporate climber, started talking about how he needed a bigger place to live. He still resided at our parents' house, though now he had his own luxurious bedroom suite, the one I'd never been allowed to occupy. He complained that commuting to his job was stressful, that he needed a home closer to downtown. My parents suggested I give up my modest 2-bedroom condo to him, which I had just purchased with a combination of savings and a small inheritance from my maternal grandfather. Hearing their proposal, I felt a harsh sting of betrayal all over again. They pitched it as if it were perfectly logical. You can always find another place, they reasoned, but Derek has a demanding career. I tried to remain composed, but inside, I was boiling with anger. Here I was, the child they'd pushed out for lack of space, only to be expected to relinquish my hard-earned home for my brother's convenience. My mother, recovering though she was, still had the energy to argue that if I truly loved my family, I would do anything to help Derek succeed. My father nodded in solemn agreement. I refused. The look on my parents' faces when I declined was a toxic mix of shock, disappointment, and subtle rage. Derek didn't say anything at first, but then he shrugged and said, "It's okay. I'm sure Sis will come around once she thinks it through." My mother gave me a long, piercing stare, as though she couldn't believe her own daughter was capable of such selfishness. I tried explaining that I had worked tirelessly to buy that condo, that it represented the stability they never provided for me. My father cut me off, insisting that a family should function as a unified team. "It's not like you have kids or a spouse to worry about," he said, as if my life was automatically less important simply because I was single. I swallowed every retort that threatened to escape, knowing it would only escalate the tension. After an agonizing dinner where conversation was limited to Derek's achievements, I left. My heart pounded in my chest as I drove back to my condo. I tried to calm myself, but the sheer audacity of their demand rang in my ears like a cruel echo. I didn't sleep that night. The following weeks were a blur of missed calls from my parents and text messages from Derek, each one more guilt-laden than the last. I blocked them temporarily, needing space to breathe. In that time, I immersed myself in work. My job at a local marketing firm became my refuge. My boss noticed my willingness to take on extra assignments, and soon I was juggling multiple campaigns. Some nights, I slept in my office, too drained to drive back. I poured my frustrations into perfecting every project, leaving no room for my thoughts to drift to my family's demands. Eventually, I unblocked them. My voicemail overflowed with messages. My mother's voice was tearful and shaky, accusing me of turning my back on the people who loved me unconditionally. My father demanded I fix the situation, saying he'd taught me better than to be so ungrateful. Derek's texts took a kinder tone, oddly enough. He insisted he appreciated my position, that he understood how hard it must be for me to give up my condo. But then he'd follow up with more manipulative lines, like telling me how disappointed Dad was, how stressed out Mom was becoming. It was all so carefully orchestrated. Late one night, I got a surprise visitor. I was halfway through a bowl of cereal when someone knocked on my condo door. I looked through the peephole and saw Derek standing there, the hallway's fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across his face. Against my better judgment, I let him in. He took in the small living room, the mismatched furniture, the worn rugs, and looked vaguely amused. Then he launched into a rehearsed spiel about how much this place would mean to him, how our parents were only pressuring me because they loved us both and wanted to see us thrive. I felt an old, familiar anger brimming inside me. "Why can't you just get your own place?" I asked, exasperated. He grinned, shrugged, and admitted he could, but that our parents had insisted this arrangement was best for family unity. I stared at him, searching his face for any sign of genuine remorse or empathy. He gave me none. Instead, he told me he planned to propose to his girlfriend soon and that they'd need a comfortable home base to start a family. "And you," he said pointedly, "don't have that kind of pressure." My hands shook with rage. I told him to leave. He tried to protest, stepping closer as if he could intimidate me, but I was past caring. My voice trembled with years of pent-up fury as I warned him never to show up unannounced again. He smirked and said, "You're making a big mistake," before walking out. After that, the phone calls from my parents increased tenfold. I started receiving anonymous letters at work, typed out and stuffed into plain envelopes, urging me to do the right thing for my family. My boss, noticing my distress, gently suggested I take some time off. I refused, knowing if I had too much free time, I'd only spiral deeper into the emotional chaos. Sleep became a luxury I could rarely afford, and I began living off convenience store snacks and energy drinks. My nightmares were filled with images of Derek standing in my doorway, telling me I didn't deserve anything I'd worked for. In these dreams, my parents were in the background, nodding in agreement. One morning, I woke up to find the words, "selfish brat," spray painted across my condo door. The sight of it made my stomach lurch. I couldn't prove it was Derek, but I knew. That was my breaking point. I contacted a lawyer friend to ask what I could do if my family continued to harass me. She explained that I could file a restraining order, but suggested I gather more concrete evidence first. I installed security cameras around my condo and informed my building's management about the situation. At work, I told HR about the letters, handing them over as proof. My colleagues were surprisingly supportive, offering to escort me to and from my car if I ever felt unsafe. Despite all these precautions, I was miserable. I found myself jumping at every unexpected sound, scanning every crowd for familiar faces. The heartbreak of realizing your own flesh and blood can be a source of danger is indescribably painful. Even so, I clung to the hope that my parents might come around, that they'd see how wrong they were to prioritize Derek's ambitions over my well-being. But every time I checked my phone and saw another missed call, my chest seized up. There were days I truly hated them, and then I'd feel guilty for harboring such fury. It was an endless cycle of resentment and remorse, spinning like a whirlwind inside me. I dreaded the day I received a cryptic text from Derek. "We need to talk. Urgent." Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet him in a public cafe, well lit and crowded. He arrived 15 minutes late, as if to demonstrate how little regard he had for my time. Before I could utter a word, he placed a shiny envelope on the table. Inside was an invitation to his engagement party, scheduled to take place in just a couple of weeks. At my parents' house, of course. He said he wanted me there, that he hoped we could put everything behind us for the sake of the celebration. I stared at the embossed letters, feeling a wave of sadness. It was never about apology or reconciliation. It was about keeping up appearances. I told him I wasn't interested, but he pressed on, reminding me how much it would mean to our mother. Then, with a dramatic sigh, he confessed that our parents planned to sign the house over to him as a wedding gift. If only I'd stopped being so difficult about my condo. My head spun. They were essentially trying to bribe me into compliance with yet another display of favoritism. I left the cafe without saying goodbye. The next day, I saw that my security cameras had captured footage of someone lurking outside my condo building at night. Tall, male, with a hood pulled low. The image was grainy, but it made my skin crawl. My lawyer friend advised me to install better lighting and keep the footage in a safe place. I felt trapped in a horror story of my own family's making. Each new incident chipped away at the lingering affection I held for them. At times, I found myself crying over old family photos, wondering when exactly love had morphed into this monstrous power struggle. Meanwhile, my job became my anchor in the storm. I poured myself into every assignment, eventually earning a promotion that gave me a modest raise. I used that extra money to fortify my condo with a more advanced security system. If they were going to keep trying to intimidate me, I would make it as difficult as possible. But a gnawing feeling grew in my chest. How long could I live like this? Always looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next blow? Was there a path to peace, or was I stuck forever? 3 days before Derek's engagement party, I received a call from my mother. Her voice sounded frail, even weaker than after her hospital stay. She begged me to come to the party, saying she didn't have much energy left, that she wanted one more memory of the whole family together. I felt my defenses waver. Despite everything, she was still my mother, and part of me yearned for any genuine sign that she cared for me without conditions. So, I agreed to attend, fully aware I might regret it. On the day of the party, I drove to my parents' house with my heart in my throat. The place was decked out in balloons and banners, the lawn meticulously trimmed. Derek's fiancée, a sweet-looking woman named Kimberly, greeted me at the door. She gave me a polite smile, probably oblivious to the drama swirling around her soon-to-be husband. Inside, my mother was seated in an armchair, looking paler than I remembered. She reached out for my hand and whispered, "Thank you for coming." I squeezed her hand, unable to form words. My father stood nearby, his gaze cold and distant, arms folded across his chest. Derek was nowhere in sight. As guests began to trickle in, I kept to the fringes of the gathering, sipping a soda and forcing a polite smile whenever someone glanced my way. My parents played the gracious hosts, praising Derek's accomplishments to anyone who would listen. Finally, Derek made his grand entrance with Kimberly at his side, everyone applauding as if he were royalty. My heart pounded. I felt suffocated, a flood of memories crashing over me. His smirks, his smug remarks, the times he'd manipulated our parents into blaming me for his mistakes. But I couldn't leave, not yet. My mother's eyes followed me across the room, silently pleading for some sign that I was going to cooperate, to fall back in line. Toward the end of the night, Derek clinked his glass to get everyone's attention. He thanked our parents, boasted about how they would be signing the deed to the house over to him. Laughter and applause followed, and I noticed how my father's eyes flicked toward me. Derek continued, "And there's more good news. My wonderful sister has agreed to help Kimberly and me find the perfect home once we're ready to expand our family." Everyone turned to look at me expectantly. I hesitated, every fiber of my being screaming to reject this charade. Then I realized something. I had spent my entire life letting them dictate my worth. If I gave them what they wanted, it would never end. So, with all eyes on me, I took a steadying breath and said, "Actually, I have an announcement. I won't be helping Derek with anything, and I won't be giving up my condo." The room fell silent. My father's face darkened, and my mother's mouth formed a trembling "oh." Derek gaped, speechless. I swallowed hard, my pulse hammering in my ears, and added, "I'm done bending to other people's expectations. If you can't accept me on my own terms, then we have nothing left to say." A tension so thick it seemed tangible crept across the guests. Then, quietly, I walked out the door, my dignity intact for the first time in years. In the days that followed, I blocked every single member of my family on every platform. My phone chimed with unknown numbers, but I ignored them. I realized I wasn't the one losing out. They had lost me, and that was their own doing. From the moment I saw the second pink line on the pregnancy test, I felt a mixture of thrill and terror. I was only 22, newly graduated from college, and married to Timothy, the gentlest soul I'd ever met. People always said we rushed into marriage, but we loved each other fiercely. That day, when I confirmed I was expecting, I thought my parents would either be thrilled or panicked. Instead, their response was a silent, drawn-out disappointment that quickly turned into anger once Timothy was diagnosed with lupus. He had been feeling tired for months, but we never expected a chronic disease. My parents, who prided themselves on their healthy lifestyle and old-fashioned values, took it as a sign of weakness, almost as if his illness was a moral failing. The days after his diagnosis were a blur of doctor appointments, medication trials, and my mounting dread about our family's reaction. It never occurred to me that they would reject us so completely. After a terse phone call one evening, they informed me that my husband and future child were not their family. They told me it would be best if we never contacted them again. I remember sinking to the floor, clutching my phone, feeling tears burn my cheeks. It wasn't shock alone, it was heartbreak. Timothy tried to comfort me, but his own eyes brimmed with sorrow. We realized that moment was the final rupture, an unforgivable betrayal that would scar us all. All of us would be different. I moved forward without them, even though it felt unnatural. Timothy and I navigated the unpredictability of his lupus, juggling multiple specialists while preparing for our baby's arrival. Our small apartment in the heart of the city became a cocoon of determination. We sold personal items we no longer needed, budgeted every penny, and agreed that, no matter what happened, we would stand by each other. There were moments when I longed to pick up the phone and call my parents, but I would force myself to remember their last conversation, the harsh words, the cold dismissal, the sense of being exiled from my own family. When the baby kicked inside me, a stubborn flicker of hope tried to convince me that maybe, somehow, they would come around. But it never happened. I went into labor early on a humid August afternoon, rushing to the hospital with a backpack that held baby clothes, snacks, and our dog-eared insurance papers. Timothy was at my side, pale from his own struggles, but resolute. During those agonizing hours of contractions, I cried not just from physical pain, but from the ache of missing parents who should have been there. I envied the other women I saw in the maternity ward, surrounded by mothers and fathers, by siblings and grandparents. Yet, when our daughter Lily arrived, the overwhelming love that flooded my heart was enough to drown out every rejection I had ever felt. She was ours, and that was all that mattered. Truly, Timothy's health remained precarious, but he clung to fatherhood like a lifeline. Lily thrived in our cramped living room, taking her first wobbly steps on the peeling linoleum floor. We had exactly 2 chairs and a sagging couch, yet our home felt brimming with warmth. My occasional sadness about my parents transformed into quiet acceptance. It was a formidable mental shift, but I told myself that if they had chosen to abandon me at my most vulnerable, then maybe it was better for Lily to never know them. Whenever I went grocery shopping and saw a mother with her adult daughter picking out cereal boxes together, I felt a pang of envy that I swiftly shoved aside. I had Timothy, I had Lily, and I needed nothing else. That said, life wasn't simple. Hospital visits drained our savings. Timothy often couldn't get out of bed, and I juggled Lily, my part-time bookstore job, and his doctor appointments. I learned the intricacies of insurance forms, discovered cheaper prescriptions, and cried quietly from exhaustion. Sometimes I resented my parents. Their moral support would have eased my burden, but I wouldn't let bitterness define me. Lily needed a mother who refused to drown in what-ifs. So I focused on small victories, Lily's first words, Timothy's improvements, and the modest celebrations we made out of discount pizza and homemade cupcakes. In those tiny joys, I found a version of wholeness that shielded us from despair. Everything felt fragile, yet also so oddly complete now. 3 years slipped away in that manner. Lily turned 3 with an explosion of balloons I bought from the dollar store, while Timothy mustered his best energy to blow them up. She laughed as they floated across our living room, her curly hair bouncing with delight. I remember thinking that, in spite of everything, we'd managed to create a loving environment. Then, out of nowhere, my phone buzzed one Sunday morning. It was an unknown number, and I nearly let it go to voicemail. Something compelled me to pick up, and the voice on the other end made my stomach clench. It was my mother. She asked how I was, as if no time had passed. Then she stumbled through a stiff apology, though the words sounded forced, almost rehearsed. My father, she said, was in the car, listening. And that's when she uttered something I never thought I'd hear. They wanted to come visit us, to finally meet Lily, and to make amends. I stood there, phone pressed to my ear, mind whirling, heart pounding, unsure whether to sob or scream or laugh. The apology was what I'd always fantasized about, yet the pain of those 3 years was still raw. I told her I needed time to process, and hung up without giving an answer. Timothy, hearing my ragged breathing, asked what was wrong. For a moment, I couldn't find the words. I whispered, "They're back," and felt fear, anger, and an inexplicable surge of longing fuse inside. Over the next week, I wrestled with whether to allow them into our lives. Timothy, supportive as ever, told me the choice was mine alone. Part of me wanted to protect Lily from their sudden interest, worried they'd hurt her the way they hurt me. Another part of me longed for the chance to see them hold her, to watch my daughter experience grandparents even if it was late. Ultimately, I agreed to a tentative meeting in a neutral place, a local cafe with outdoor seating. On the day of, Lily wore her favorite yellow dress, oblivious to the emotional storm swirling around her. We found a small table near the bougainvillea, and my heart hammered when I saw my parents step onto the patio. My mother's face looked older, more lined than I remembered, and my father's posture seemed stiffer, as though regret weighed him down. I braced myself for a surge of anger or tears, but all that came was an odd numbness. They approached slowly, almost timidly, and my father's eyes flickered to Timothy, who sat quietly by my side. Lily, sensing the tension, scooted onto my lap. Nobody spoke for several awkward seconds, until my mother forced a smile and said hello to Lily. I managed a polite nod. Then we all sat, hearts pounding, searching for something to say, as if we were strangers who had never known a single thing about one another. The silence weighed a lifetime, filling the gap left by lost years. An hour later, we were still stuck in small talk, carefully skirting around the subject of their abandonment. My mother asked Lily about her favorite color, her toys, and her snack preferences. My father inquired about our jobs, nodding quietly when Timothy revealed he'd stopped working full-time due to lupus. Nobody mentioned the diagnosis or the cruel words from the past. It was as though we'd all collectively decided to stuff those memories into a box for the duration of this tense reunion. But the strain was palpable, especially when Lily asked my parents why they had never visited her before. My mother's eyes darted to mine, tears threatening to spill over, while my father's face went rigid. I had no idea how to rescue them from the truth. After a choking moment, my mother said something about living far away and having complications. Timothy stared at me, his expression unreadable, but I could feel the tension in his shoulders. I wanted to protect Lily from their excuses, yet at the same time, I yearned to hear them admit they had been wrong. The cafe was crowded, and I could sense curious glances from neighboring tables as our stilted conversation continued. Finally, we parted with an awkward promise to meet again. No hugging, no tearful goodbyes, just a lingering sense that this was only the beginning of a long, complicated chapter. I drove home with my stomach in knots, wondering if the second chance they offered was genuine or doomed. In the days that followed, my parents called more often. My mother sent messages asking for photos of Lily or updates about Timothy's health. I was torn between curiosity and lingering resentment. Each time I heard the phone vibrate, my heartbeat quickened with both excitement and dread. Timothy encouraged me to keep an open mind, pointing out that people sometimes change. Yet, I worried about letting them waltz back into my life without acknowledging the harm they had done. My mother did attempt a more formal apology over the phone, saying they had been confused and overwhelmed by Timothy's diagnosis. But their words, though contrite, felt incomplete. I wanted them to say, "We were wrong and we are sorry." Instead, they spoke in vague terms of regret. Meanwhile, Lily was fascinated by the idea of grandparents. She chattered to me about what grandparents did, asking if they would bring stories or cookies like she had seen on TV. Her eagerness tore at me. Despite everything, I found myself hoping that maybe this could be salvaged, that Lily might get grandparents who genuinely cared about her. Timothy agreed to invite them for dinner one weekend, and I spent days fretting over the menu, the tidiness of our apartment, and whether my parents would feel welcomed or critical. That Saturday evening, I prepared roast chicken, vegetables, and a cheesecake for dessert. My hands shook as I set the table, waiting for the knock on our door. I whispered a silent prayer, trembling. When my parents arrived, Lily ran to greet them, curiosity shining in her wide eyes. My father bent awkwardly to pat her head, and my mother handed her a small plush rabbit. Lily giggled, hugging the toy, and I felt a surge of cautious hope. Timothy stood behind me, offering a polite smile. We ushered them inside, where the aroma of roasting chicken filled the air. The conversation started with innocent topics: Lily's preschool, Timothy's latest doctor visit, my bookstore job. My parents nodded, occasionally asking questions. I sensed their efforts to be kind, but the elephant in the room, those hateful words and years of silence, remained. When we finally sat down to eat, the tension thickened. My father kept his gaze on his plate, barely making eye contact with Timothy. My mother complimented the meal, though her voice trembled. Then Timothy gently broached the subject we all avoided. He asked why they had cut us off when he was diagnosed, and whether they understood how deeply they had hurt us. My parents exchanged an uneasy glance. My father cleared his throat, stammering about fearing the worst for me, that he thought Timothy's illness would ruin my life, and that he had panicked. My mother tried to add that they had no idea how to handle such news. It wasn't the heartfelt apology I dreamed of, but it was a start. We ate mostly in silence after that, the only sounds being silverware scraping plates and Lily's occasional babble. Heart fluttered. In the following months, my parents tried to redeem themselves. My mother offered to babysit Lily whenever Timothy had hospital appointments. My father, less expressive, joined them on walks to the park, occasionally bringing small gifts for Lily: coloring books, stickers, or fruit snacks. They still struggled with open displays of affection, and the apologies remained incomplete, but at least they showed up. I watched them carefully, alert for any sign of judgment toward Timothy's limitations, but they seemed genuinely invested in forging a relationship with their granddaughter. At times, I nearly let my guard down. Then doubts would creep in, memories of that phone call, the cruelty in my father's tone when he said Lily and Timothy weren't family. In hushed conversations late at night, Timothy reminded me that healing was a process and that letting them try might benefit Lily in the long run. He acknowledged that no apology could fully erase the damage, but he believed in second chances. I was less convinced, but I tried, for Lily's sake. One crisp afternoon, my parents suggested taking Lily to the aquarium. I hesitated, uncertain whether to trust them alone with her, but Timothy urged me to accept. They returned 3 hours later with a glowing Lily excitedly describing jellyfish and sharks. My mother held her hand, and my father looked almost proud. For a fleeting moment, I saw the grandparents they could have been all along, and it wrenched my heart more than their absence ever had, silently ached. Silently, I never expected the turn of events that came next. One evening, after an unusually pleasant family dinner, my mother pulled me aside and confessed they wanted Lily to visit them for an entire week during the holidays. My heart dropped. Though it was a sign of acceptance, the thought of Lily spending so many days alone with them felt overwhelming. They insisted it would give Timothy and me some rest, which we admittedly needed. After much deliberation, we agreed, hoping it would strengthen the fragile bond. Lily left with them on a snowy morning, carrying a tiny suitcase and wearing a beaming grin. 4 days later, I received an urgent call from my mother. Her voice shook as she asked if Timothy could come immediately. My father had fallen gravely ill, she said, and they were desperate. At first, I didn't understand why she wanted Timothy, until she revealed that doctors suspected my father might have lupus as well. Shock rattled me. I had never imagined my father might be going through the same medical crisis he had once denounced in Timothy. Heart-pounding, I told Timothy, and his eyes widened with a mix of empathy and fear. We drove through the night, dread coiling in my gut. By the time we reached the hospital, my mother was pacing the corridor, guilt etched on her face. She looked at Timothy, tears brimming, and asked him for help. Her words struck like lightning. "We need you to guide us through this." I never imagined I'd be pacing my living room at 3 a.m, trying to soothe the anxiety rattling through my chest as I replayed every detail of how my life had spun out of control. Yet here I am, unable to silence the echoes of my choices and his betrayals. It all began so slowly, the way a hairline crack in a windshield spreads until suddenly the glass is beyond repair. 5 years ago, Jonah and I said our vows beneath a gazebo decorated with fairy lights. I believed in the sanctity of our union, convinced that my heart was safe in his hands. He was charming, intelligent, and so attentive that I thought we'd conquer every challenge side by side. When I became pregnant with our daughter, Ava, he fussed over every detail. He read baby books, picked out the crib, and doted on me through bouts of morning sickness. I was thrilled, grateful, and maybe just a little naive. I told myself our partnership was unbreakable. Even when he first mentioned his new coworker, Priscilla, I paid little attention, dismissing the possibility of anything untoward. He'd been at the marketing firm for 3 years, and I trusted him implicitly. She was just a friend, someone who liked the same sitcoms and shared lunch breaks with him. At the time, it seemed harmless. I was busy too. My job as a speech therapist involved long hours, and Ava was still a toddler who commanded every spare moment of my energy. Looking back, I should have seen the red flags waving. The nights he worked late, the mysterious phone calls he whispered through, the new cologne he bought just because. But I brushed off my misgivings, telling myself that he was allowed to have a social life outside our marriage. I never suspected I was loosening my grip on something crucial. By the time I realized just how far we had drifted, it was already too late. When Jonah finally admitted he was leaving me, it was a Tuesday in the middle of fall. Ava was coloring a picture of a puppy, so absorbed in her crayons that she didn't even notice how her father's voice shook or how my posture turned rigid. He said the words in a rush. "I'm not happy. I think I've fallen in love with someone else. It's Priscilla." My ears started ringing, and I thought I might pass out. Instead, I stood perfectly still, feeling my soul exit my body in slow motion. It was surreal to see his lips move, to hear him apologize, to listen to him promise that this was best for everyone. A hot wave of anger scalded my throat, but I refused to scream while Ava was within earshot. I waited until she was tucked in bed that night before the argument started. When I finally lost my composure, a screaming match ensued in the kitchen, accusations and curses flung back and forth like shards of broken glass. I couldn't look at him without picturing the two of them together, perhaps in the office break room, giggling at some private joke. Every emotion I'd been too busy to feel came crashing over me. Rage, betrayal, embarrassment, sadness. He insisted this wasn't my fault, that he'd just changed, grown bored or dissatisfied. It was as though he'd become a stranger overnight, and I was left grappling with the fallout. He moved out 3 days later, collecting a duffel bag of clothing and a few personal items while I pretended not to watch from the hallway. Ava cried incessantly for a week, asking why Daddy didn't come home after work anymore. Though Jonah offered to keep things civil, civility soon became a fragile facade that cracked whenever money or Ava was involved. We agreed he could see her on weekends, and I offered no resistance despite the pain it caused me. I told myself that Ava deserved to have her father, regardless of my own agony. I desperately tried to pretend life was normal, keeping up with my clients, cooking homemade dinners for Ava, and smiling through every conversation. Yet the nights brought insomnia. I'd stare at the ceiling, replaying old memories. Our wedding dance, the day Ava was born, our first Christmas together. Like a cruel joke, those recollections only made the emptiness feel sharper. Eventually, I discovered that Jonah and Priscilla had moved in together. He chose a small one-bedroom apartment closer to their office. It stung, realizing he'd left the house we'd bought together, a place with a fenced backyard and a cozy fireplace, for a cramped rental with peeling wallpaper. But apparently, that was enough for him, or maybe it was all they could afford. When we talked on the phone, he tried to maintain a casual tone, informing me about rent prices and how expensive city living could be. I could barely stand to hear his voice. Every word felt like another arrow lodged in my chest, a reminder that he'd traded our family life for something I couldn't quite grasp. Then, a few months later, the truth began to unravel his carefully curated narrative. He started missing child support payments, always with some excuse about unexpected bills. He'd promised to pay me back the following week, but the checks never arrived on time. I confronted him, voice trembling, demanding an explanation. He blamed work stress, the higher cost of living, a new car repair that drained his bank account. Every conversation ended with me furious, vowing not to believe any more of his pleas. After one especially tense phone call, my eyes burned with tears, not just because of the money, but because of what it signified. The man who once insisted we always save for a rainy day had apparently thrown all caution, and our daughter's stability, to the wind. Eventually, Jonah confessed that Priscilla was pregnant. He said it casually, as though telling me about the weather, but his voice had a tremor. I discovered he'd told Ava first, which enraged me even more. She was the one who spilled the news at dinner, asking if the baby would live with Daddy or with us. I managed not to drop the serving spoon as my blood chilled. That night, I demanded Jonah explain himself, but his answers were maddeningly vague. "It just happened," he murmured, as though that justified the heartbreak he'd inflicted. I couldn't fathom how he could move on so quickly. Memories of my own pregnancy returned, how carefully he'd cradled my bump, how he read parenting books aloud to me in bed. Now he'd have that experience with someone else, and I was relegated to a bystander, forced to watch him build a second life. The deeper I dug, the clearer it became that Jonah's finances were in dire shape. Apparently, the marketing firm where he worked was downsizing, and he'd missed out on a promotion he'd been counting on. Priscilla had gone on early maternity leave because of complications. Suddenly, the glamorous new relationship Jonah had abandoned me for began to appear riddled with cracks. My sympathy was minimal. I still wanted him to support Ava, but otherwise, his hardships felt like karmic justice. It might sound cruel, but after what he'd done, I couldn't muster the compassion I once had. The real problem, however, was that he started dragging Ava into his desperate attempts to prove he was a capable father. On weekends, he'd borrow money from his mother to take Ava to amusement parks or fancy dinners he couldn't actually afford. Ava would come home buzzing about cotton candy or special rides, clueless that I'd be the one fielding phone calls from bill collectors once Jonah inevitably failed to meet his obligations. When I tried confronting him about exposing Ava to financial instability, he brushed me off, claiming she was having fun. I tried to maintain composure, but inside, I was seething. He was parading her around like a trophy, all in hopes of reassuring Priscilla or convincing himself that he wasn't floundering. One evening, an argument erupted over the phone. Jonah demanded he keep Ava for an entire week, insisting that it would show Priscilla he was serious about family. My chest tightened as I realized he was using our daughter as a pawn to lure Priscilla back into his good graces. She had apparently moved out temporarily, anxious about financial stress and unsure if Jonah could be a reliable partner before the baby arrived. The very idea that my daughter's presence might be leveraged to sway Priscilla's decisions enraged me. I refused outright, telling Jonah that if he wanted to spend more time with Ava, it would have to be arranged through proper legal channels. He fumed, accusing me of sabotaging his relationship. The call ended in furious silence. 2 days later, I got a text message from Jonah's mother, who anxiously asked if I'd heard from him. He hadn't shown up for work. Alarmed, I realized he was supposed to pick Ava up that Friday, and he never did. Terrified scenarios flashed in my head. Had he taken her without telling me? Had something happened to him en route? I discovered that Jonah had driven halfway across the state in a misguided attempt to track down Priscilla at her parents' place. Ava wasn't with him, thank God, but the entire episode rattled me to the core. That night, I called my attorney, explaining that I needed to formalize our custody arrangement immediately. Trusting Jonah's word was no longer an option. The next morning, we began filing the necessary papers, and I realized how absurdly grateful I was that the worst-case scenario, him disappearing with Ava, hadn't come to pass. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. Legal fees, daycare costs, and the emotional toll weighed heavily on my shoulders. Ava would ask me if Daddy was okay, her small face crumpled in concern. I never knew how to respond. If I told her the truth, that Daddy was flailing and making terrible decisions, she wouldn't understand. So I'd give her a reassuring hug and tell her that Daddy was just busy, that we both loved her very much. Sometimes I wondered if I was lying to protect her or deceiving myself into hoping that Jonah might revert to the stable, loving man I once knew. Either way, the strain was undeniable. A week later, Jonah showed up at the house unannounced, looking more disheveled than I'd ever seen him. He was unshaven, his eyes rimmed with red, and he practically begged me to let him speak with Ava. She was at my mother's place for the afternoon, so I allowed him inside to talk, albeit reluctantly. He slumped onto the couch, tears pooling in his eyes, and told me he was afraid Priscilla would never come back. She had threatened to raise the baby alone if he couldn't demonstrate he was financially stable. I tried to feel something akin to pity, but it didn't come. He asked if I'd consider lowering his child support temporarily until he got back on his feet. I reminded him that his daughter's needs didn't pause just because he'd mismanaged his resources. The conversation ended with me telling him I was following my lawyer's advice. Jonah left, shoulders drooping like a man lugging the weight of his regrets, and I was left feeling hollow. Later that night, as I tucked Ava into bed, she asked when Daddy was coming to get her again. I said soon, but my mind raced with worries about each future visit. Things reached a breaking point when Priscilla had a scare late in her pregnancy, and Jonah nearly lost it over the phone, ranting that he should have custody of Ava, just in case. In case of what, I never fully understood. He seemed desperate, trapped between trying to salvage his new relationship and proving he was a responsible parent. It was an impossible charade, and he was faltering on every front. My lawyer moved quickly to schedule a hearing, aware that Jonah's unpredictability was growing more dangerous by the day. On the night before our court date, I stared at the paperwork spread across my dining table. Bank statements, missed payment records, text messages. My head swam with the injustice of having to prove my own worthiness as a mother when Jonah was the one who'd wrecked our family in the first place. But the legal process requires documentation, facts on paper that show the judge the reality of our situation. I felt physically ill, imagining Jonah's pleas in court. Part of me dreaded the heartbreak it would cause Ava if he lost joint custody, but the other part of me steeled itself, determined to protect my child from his chaos. Court day arrived, and I clutched my attorney's hand like a life preserver as we entered the sterile room. Jonah sat across from me, eyes hollow, hair hastily combed. Priscilla was nowhere in sight, but I wouldn't have been surprised if she was lingering in the hallway. The judge was a stern-faced woman who reminded me of my high school principal. Jonah's lawyer tried to paint him as a loving father who'd merely hit a rough patch, while my attorney presented evidence of his financial irresponsibility and manipulative behavior. My stomach churned each time I had to articulate just how unstable Jonah had become. I felt a pang of guilt when he buried his face in his hands, but I reminded myself of all the times he let Ava down. The judge eventually adjourned to review everything, leaving us in a thick, suffocating silence. A week later, the ruling came down. I was granted primary custody, with Jonah allowed supervised visitation until he could demonstrate consistent, reliable behavior. My relief was immediate, but so was a fresh wave of sorrow. Once upon a time, I had believed Jonah and I would watch Ava grow up together, celebrating milestones in harmony. Now, a court order defined the boundaries of his fatherhood. Ava was too young to comprehend the legal jargon. She only knew that Daddy wasn't picking her up alone anymore. She asked questions, endless, heartbreaking questions I couldn't fully answer. I tried to keep my explanations gentle, telling her that Daddy needed extra help right now. She accepted this with the kind of quiet resignation only children can exude, though she still looked perplexed when Jonah visited under the watchful eye of a counselor. My mother came to stay with us for a while, offering support and a comforting presence in the house that often felt haunted by memories. On the financial side, things remained complicated. Jonah missed a few more payments, but the court now had stricter enforcement measures in place. Priscilla's baby was born early, and I heard through the grapevine that Jonah was sleeping on a friend's couch. A part of me wanted to feel satisfied, but mostly, I just felt numb. I had no energy left to hate him. My focus was on Ava, shielding her from every ripple of instability that Jonah's choices caused. If he wanted to climb out of that pit, he'd have to do it on his own. It took me months to accept that my once husband was a stranger. I used to replay our best times, how he'd surprise me with chocolate croissants on Sunday mornings, or how we sang show tunes in the car. But those recollections were like postcards from a place that didn't exist anymore. My love for him had been replaced by a weary sort of caution. Love can't flourish in distrust, and I no longer trusted him with anything that mattered. My heart ached mostly for Ava, who would grow up with a father too enmeshed in his own chaos to be the steady presence she deserved. On good days, I could see that she was resilient, that her smile still reached her eyes when we baked cookies or watched cartoons in our pajamas. On bad days, she'd retreat into herself, asking why Daddy wasn't here to tuck her in. I held her close, promising that I'd never leave her side. The guilt of having brought her into a situation where her father chose someone else was a torment I wrestled with privately, but I tried not to let it taint our relationship. She was innocent, and my job was to protect her innocence for as long as I could. One afternoon, months after everything had come to light, I crossed paths with Priscilla outside the office building she no longer worked at. She was standing on the curb, holding an infant car seat. I froze, unsure whether to keep walking or confront her. She recognized me first, her face a mix of dread and sorrow. Without the colorful lipstick or the confident stride I'd once envied, she looked exhausted and disillusioned. Words spilled out before I could stop them. Questions about her child, about Jonah, about why she'd ever stepped into our marriage. She answered softly, voice trembling as she confessed that she never meant for this to happen. She thought Jonah was separated when they got involved, and by the time she learned the truth, she'd developed feelings she couldn't simply switch off. I found no solace in her explanation, but I glimpsed her fear. She was a single mother now, frightened by the realization that Jonah's promises were as fragile as spun sugar. We parted in an awkward hush. I didn't wish her ill, but I couldn't manage kindness either. My loyalty was to Ava, and the rest was just wreckage in Jonah's wake. Time has a way of dulling even the sharpest pain. Months turned into a year, and while Jonah remained a fleeting presence in Ava's life, supervised visits, occasional phone calls, I found myself regaining a semblance of stability. My speech therapy practice flourished, ironically due to the extra hours I poured into my work as a distraction. Ava started preschool, and I embraced the joys of motherhood in a calmer environment. If Jonah realized the full weight of his mistakes, he never said it out loud. Last I heard, he was bouncing between jobs, still burdened by debt, and tenuously co-parenting with Priscilla, who refused to live with him again unless he sorted out his life. I no longer lost sleep over his decisions. They were his to make, and I had a daughter who depended on me to provide her with a world that felt safe and nurturing. We live in a small suburban home now, just me and Ava. Sometimes, after she's in bed, I sit on the porch swing and let myself remember the good times, not because I miss Jonah, but because I want to remind myself that I did once love him. I'm learning to distinguish between the person he was and the person he became. The heartbreak is real, but I have survived it. More importantly, Ava is thriving in her own gentle way. She laughs openly, paints colorful pictures at school, and wakes up excited about life. That, to me, is victory enough. I don't know what the future holds for Jonah or Priscilla, or for the child they brought into this complicated situation. I only know that I am forging ahead, determined to give Ava the stability and love she needs. People always talk about how children are resilient, and maybe that's true, but they also absorb the unspoken tensions around them. My mission is to let Ava's childhood be as carefree as possible, even if it means I have to shoulder burdens alone. Sometimes that involves ignoring a pitiful text from Jonah asking for money, or politely rebuffing his mother's pleas that I give him another chance to do right by us. That ship has sailed. My job is to keep steering the course for Ava and me. If Jonah decides to redeem himself, he knows where to find us. But that redemption cannot come at the cost of our daughter's emotional well-being. Looking back, the cracks in our marriage were there long before Priscilla. Maybe it was overwork or complacency. Perhaps we both stopped trying. But the manner in which he ended things, abandoning me and then pulling Ava into his chaos, revealed a side of him I could never trust again. Our story was once a fairy tale in my mind. Now, it's a cautionary tale I hold on to, reminding me never to ignore my instincts or bury my doubts. My heart aches for the life we could have had, but I'm no longer shackled by bitterness. Instead, I'm rebuilding piece by piece, ensuring Ava grows up knowing she is deeply cherished. I refuse to let Jonah's downfall steal my hope or hers. Day by day, we are healing, and though I can't predict what tomorrow will bring, I know I'll face it with a strength I once doubted I possessed. I never thought my wedding day could bring so much heartache. My name is Rachel, and I'd been planning my marriage to Marcus for over a year. My parents seemed excited at first, helping me look at floral arrangements and potential venues. But then, my younger sister, Haley, announced her new house, scheduling a housewarming party for the same weekend as my wedding. At first, I thought it had to be a misunderstanding, that she couldn't overshadow my special day. When I confronted her about choosing that date, she brushed me off, leaving me with a sinking feeling in my chest. The tension grew daily. Haley insisted she wanted to celebrate her new milestone, claiming that her housewarming date was non-negotiable. My parents started spending every spare moment at her place, helping pick paint colors and furniture. Whenever I asked my mom to come dress shopping, she claimed she was busy. My dad skipped our cake tasting session because he had to fix a leaky faucet at Haley's. It hurt more than I could express, but I tried not to make waves. I told myself they'd still show up on the big day. Deep down, however, I feared something was terribly wrong. As the wedding approached, Marcus noticed my distress. He encouraged me to invite my grandparents for extra support. They were thrilled to help, accompanying me to final fittings and offering wisdom. Haley, meanwhile, smirked whenever she saw me, as though enjoying her upper hand. One afternoon, I pleaded with her to postpone her party. She refused, telling me I could always reschedule my wedding if it was such a problem. Shocked, I realized she reveled in making me squirm. My parents only fueled her behavior, praising her taste in decor while ignoring my preparations. I felt increasingly isolated and disheartened. 1 week before the ceremony, I received a crushing text from my mother, saying they might not make it to the wedding ceremony, but would try to come for the reception. I confronted them, teary-eyed, asking why Haley's housewarming took precedence. They insisted they had commitments there they couldn't back out of. I felt betrayed and alone, but my grandparents stepped up. They volunteered to walk me down the aisle if my parents remained absent. Though grateful, I was also devastated to realize my father wouldn't be at my side. I tried to remain strong, but my heart ached deeply. The night before my wedding, I paced my apartment, unable to sleep. Marcus tried to reassure me, saying we could still have a beautiful day. But anxiety gnawed at me. Around midnight, I got another message from my mother, confirming they'd be absent from the ceremony. She wrote, "We'll do our best to pop in later." I threw my phone onto the couch, tears blurring my vision. I had never felt dismissed. Marcus held me until I fell asleep, exhausted. In my dreams, I saw Haley laughing as she painted her walls, while I stood alone in a white dress. Morning arrived with a swirl of preparations. My grandparents came early, bringing pastries and unwavering support. Grandma helped me into my gown, her hands steady. Granddad offered a proud smile, assuring me this day was about Marcus and me. I felt an odd mix of nerves and relief. Just as I was about to leave for the church, Haley burst into the bridal suite, demanding to know why she wasn't included as a bridesmaid. I couldn't believe her nerve. She criticized the flowers, my dress, and even complained about the music. My frustration boiled, but I tried to stay composed. I snapped, reminding her she'd sabotaged my wedding by hosting her party. She scoffed, accusing me of overreacting. Grandma intervened, urging Haley to find a seat if she intended to stay. Haley, however, refused to budge, complaining about the decor. My anger finally burst free. I recounted all the times I'd been there for her, lending money, offering advice, only to have her ruin my day. She rolled her eyes and shoved me. I stumbled back, heart hammering. Haley had never been violent before. Granddad shouted for her to stop. She simply glared, declared she'd had enough, and marched out without apologizing. My grandparents rushed to check if I was hurt. Though my shoulder throbbed, the emotional sting felt worse. I had never expected my sister to assault me. Marcus arrived, concern etched on his face. He wanted to remove Haley from the premises entirely, but I insisted we let her stay, if only to prevent further gossip. I refused to let her think she could chase me from my own wedding. Grandma handed me an ice pack, tears shining in her eyes. I realized I had to pull myself together fast. Guests were already waiting inside the church for the ceremony. Stepping into the chapel, I tried to steady my trembling nerves. My grandparents flanked me, offering strength in place of my absent parents. The soft organ music began, and I inhaled deeply. Walking down the aisle without Mom or Dad felt surreal, but I refused to let it break me. Marcus stood at the altar, eyes full of warmth. As I joined him, I caught a glimpse of Haley in a pew, arms crossed. The minister began the ceremony, but midway through, I heard shuffling at the entrance. My parents walked in late, dressed casually, as though they'd just left Haley's house. My heart sank. They hadn't bothered to change into anything suitable for a wedding. Whispers rippled through the crowd as they slipped into a pew at the back, looking more like spectators than parents. I locked eyes with my father, but his expression was unreadable. The minister cleared his throat, and the service continued. Marcus squeezed my hand. I refocused on the vows, determined not to let their tardy arrival derail my emotions. As we spoke our promises, I felt both buoyed by my grandparents' devotion and haunted by the absence of true parental support. Still, I clung to hope. When the minister pronounced us husband and wife, I could almost forget the sting of betrayal. Marcus and I shared our first kiss as a married couple, and our guests broke into warm applause. Except Haley, who appeared more interested in her phone. My parents offered a few half-hearted claps, as though unsure whether they belonged here. My grandparents, on the other hand, beamed with pride in the front row. Their joy filled me with gratitude. The recessional music played, and I held Marcus's arm, feeling a strange blend of triumph and heartbreak. Our marriage was official, despite everything. At the reception hall next door, the mood was both celebratory and tense. My grandparents hugged me tightly, promising this day was still beautiful, no matter who tried to ruin it. Marcus and I made our entrance, smiling for photos. I kept scanning the room for my parents, but they were huddled with Haley, who was openly rolling her eyes at the decor. A few guests noticed and whispered among themselves. Trying to salvage my happiness, I cut the cake with Marcus, laughing as we fed each other small bites. For a moment, I could pretend the negativity didn't exist, yet the dark cloud lingered. My parents approached eventually, muttering weak apologies for being late. Dad claimed a sudden emergency at Haley's house caused their delay. I wanted to ask what could have been more critical than walking me down the aisle, but no words emerged. Mom tried to kiss my cheek, but I turned away, unable to hide my disappointment. Haley sauntered by, complaining about the music volume. Marcus, sensing my despair, guided me toward friends eager to congratulate us. I realized I had a choice: keep letting my family's actions destroy me, or embrace the love surrounding me. My grandparents toasted us with heartfelt speeches, praising our commitment and resilience. Grandma said she hoped this marriage would teach us that family isn't always determined by blood, but by who stands by you in hard times. Tears welled in my eyes, her words striking a chord. Haley rolled hers, sipping from a drink in the corner. My parents kept glancing at her as if seeking approval. I felt a pang of sadness, but I also felt a surge of resolve. I might not have my parents' full support, but I had my grandparents' unwavering love, and that was something priceless. After the first dance, Dad tried to pull me aside for a father-daughter moment. He stumbled over an apology, explaining they'd meant no harm. I asked why they'd made Haley's event a priority. He said she was the baby of the family and needed them more, adding something about her fragile state. My anger burned, remembering that she'd literally shoved me. I said I was done being overshadowed, that I deserved their presence too. Dad looked defensive, then murmured that I should respect Haley's needs. I turned away, tears threatening to spill, determined not to let him see me break down. Marcus found me in the hallway, hugging me gently. He reminded me this was our wedding day and encouraged me to enjoy what happiness remained. We returned to the reception, mingling with friends who genuinely cared about us. The more time I spent talking and laughing with these well-wishers, the less power Haley and my parents had over me. I watched them from afar, Haley scowling, Mom trying to soothe her, Dad hovering uncertainly. My grandparents danced together, clapping along to the upbeat music, inviting me to join. And so I did, letting the warmth of real family lift my spirits. Eventually, Haley declared she was leaving. She announced loudly she had to get back to her housewarming, as if reminding everyone of her event. My parents trailed after her, offering quick goodbyes. Part of me almost chased them, yearning to fix what was broken. But Marcus's hand on my arm anchored me. He whispered that we should let them go, that we couldn't spend our special day begging for their attention. Nodding, I stayed put. The music resumed, the lights twinkled, and my grandparents cheered when I finally returned to the dance floor. I chose to embrace my own celebration. Much later, when the last guest trickled out, I breathed a sigh of relief. My grandparents stayed until the very end, helping gather leftover favors and centerpieces. They told me they were proud of me for holding my head high. Marcus thanked them for everything, especially for stepping in so graciously. As I watched them exchange affectionate looks, I realized they had quietly become the parents I needed. I slipped my arms around them in a hug, barely finding words to express my gratitude. This day might not have gone as planned, but at least I knew who truly cared. In the days following, rumors swirled through our extended family about the wedding drama. A few relatives texted me in shock, having learned my parents chose Haley's housewarming over my ceremony. Some offered condolences, others expressed outrage. I felt a mix of embarrassment and relief. At least now, people understood why my grandparents escorted me down the aisle. Marcus and I tried to focus on the positive, replaying the moments of genuine joy, our vows, the laughter of our friends, the support from my grandparents. Still, each time I remembered Haley punching me, my heart clenched with lingering disbelief. About a week later, my sister called. I considered ignoring it, but curiosity won. She asked how married life was, sounding bored, then casually claimed she never intended to harm me. Her punch, she insisted, was a reflex. I grew furious, reminding her she'd slammed her fist into my shoulder for no reason. Haley huffed, saying I was blowing things out of proportion. My parents, apparently, had told her I was too sensitive. In that moment, I realized nothing had changed. She felt no remorse. I ended the call, feeling a final spark of anger fade into acceptance. Meanwhile, my grandparents became frequent visitors at our new place. They brought groceries, helped hang pictures, and shared their decades of marital wisdom. Each time I saw them, I was reminded that family could be chosen by heart, not just assigned by birth. Marcus teased them about spoiling us, but I knew this was their way of showing love. They never complained about my parents or Haley, never spewed bitterness. Instead, they offered steadfast compassion. I came to view their presence as an unexpected gift born from the most painful moments. One afternoon, a bulky envelope arrived from my parents. It contained a belated wedding card stuffed with a check. The note read, "We're sorry things got complicated. Love, Mom and Dad." No mention of Haley's assault, no real apology for missing the ceremony. I stared at the check, uncertain whether to rip it up or deposit it. Marcus suggested we accept the gesture, but not rely on their changing. He was right. I couldn't make them regret what they'd done. So I put the check aside, deciding I'd write a brief thank you note once my emotions settled. Over time, the shock subsided, replaced by a guarded resolve. Whenever people asked why my parents hadn't walked me down the aisle, I carefully explained that my grandparents had taken that honor. Some were appalled, others sympathetic. But sharing the story helped me heal. It also highlighted how deeply my grandparents had stepped in. Marcus would wrap his arm around me whenever I felt close to tears, reminding me of the love we'd built. He'd tell me we'd forge our own family traditions, never letting such betrayal creep into our home. Months passed, and Haley showed up unexpectedly, claiming she wanted to bury the hatchet. She brought a bottle of wine and immediately launched into tales of how expensive her renovations were. Eventually, she casually mentioned needing financial help. I felt my stomach turn. She hadn't even congratulated me on married life. Instead, she was here to exploit my goodwill again. Refusing to remain a doormat, I told her I couldn't help. Her eyes narrowed, and she accused me of being heartless. For the first time, I stood firm, reminding her how she'd punched me on my wedding day. She stormed out. That confrontation, oddly enough, gave me peace. I no longer felt compelled to keep the family facade intact. Marcus and I continued building a life that valued mutual respect. We visited my grandparents often, cherishing their stories and humor. My parents remained distant, popping up occasionally with shallow apologies or invitations that felt more like obligations. I stayed polite but detached, refusing to pretend everything was normal. Perhaps they thought time would erase my hurt, but I knew I'd never forget the sting of looking down the aisle and seeing only my grandparents, hearts brimming with love, instead of mom and dad. Friends asked how I was coping, expecting bitterness. Surprisingly, I felt freer. I hadn't realized how much I'd yearned for my parents' approval until I stopped chasing it. The moment they chose Haley's housewarming over my wedding, they forfeited the privilege of my unguarded heart. Instead, I gave that space to the people who showed up for me, my grandparents, Marcus, and our genuine friends. I realized this was a better kind of family, one built on loyalty and compassion, rather than the shaky foundation of obligation or favoritism. Looking back, I see my wedding as both a heartbreak and a blessing. The heartbreak was the betrayal, the overshadowing, the literal punch from my sister. The blessing was discovering how fiercely my grandparents loved me. They walked me down the aisle without hesitation, gave me unwavering emotional support, and shielded me from the worst of Haley's antics. No matter how unconventional it looked to the outside world, it was right for me. Sometimes, in our darkest hours, the ones who step forward reveal themselves as our true family. I'll never forget standing at the altar, my granddad squeezing my hand while Grandma dabbed tears of joy. They made me feel safe and cherished. Even now, when I flip through wedding pictures, I see the moment they guided me in place of my parents, and my chest warms with gratitude. I refuse to let my sister's malice define my day. Yes, she caused chaos, but she also exposed a deeper truth. Blood relation doesn't guarantee love, and real support can come from unexpected corners. Marcus and I still laugh about how surreal it was. We'd originally imagined a perfect family tableau, Dad proudly giving me away, Mom fussing over my veil, Haley as a supportive maid of honor. Instead, we got a disjointed version, with my grandparents filling the parental roles and Haley storming out in a rage. Yet, in the end, our love shone brighter than all the drama. My grandparents helped me see that I owed no apologies for wanting my wedding to be about my future, not my sister's new house. Sometimes, late at night, I remember the child version of Haley I once protected. I wonder where that closeness went. Perhaps jealousy consumed her, or she became addicted to being the favorite. I can't say for sure. What I do know is that I can't sacrifice my happiness on the altar of her demands. Nor can I pretend my parents' neglect never happened. I've learned to accept them as they are, flawed people who made a hurtful choice. I'll keep my distance until they show genuine remorse, if they ever do. Whenever I see my grandparents now, I thank them for everything. Grandma always smiles, telling me it was an honor to walk me down the aisle. Granddad jokes that he had to relearn how to stand straight without a cane, just to make sure our procession looked good. Their humility touches me. They never criticize my parents outright. They simply keep showing me how real love behaves. In their presence, I don't feel abandoned anymore. I feel claimed, protected, and wholeheartedly loved. And so, that's how my parents ended up ditching my wedding for my sister's housewarming, where she physically struck me before vanishing into her own drama. My grandparents, however, rose above the pettiness and walked me down the aisle instead. When I share this story, people often gasp at the betrayal, but then smile at the uplifting twist. It's unpredictable, yes, but also a testament to the resilience of love. I've grown stronger, building a marriage rooted in loyalty, while my grandparents remain pillars of support. If I could speak to my past self, I would say, you deserve better than you think. A canceled father-daughter walk doesn't define your worth. Being assaulted by your sister doesn't mean you're to blame. Parents who prioritize the wrong child reveal their true capacity, or lack thereof, to love. On your wedding day, the people meant to be there for you will show up, even if they're not the ones you expected. And it is in that surprising commitment that you find genuine family, walking you into a brighter future, arm in arm, no matter who else fails to appear. Brother borrowed $30K from me, brushed it off as ancient history. When I asked for repayment, then boasted vacations online. Now he's facing prison for fraud and begging for forgiveness. I used to think that the concept of family was simple. You shared the same blood, stuck up for each other, and maybe borrowed a few dollars now and then without fuss. My brother Curtis always had a way of turning that simplicity on its head. I never thought he'd be the kind of person to take advantage of me. We were raised together in the same cramped 3-bedroom house, just 2 kids listening to our parents argue about overdue bills and the price of groceries. Neither of us came from much, but we shared everything: secrets, Christmas presents, sometimes even clothes. It wasn't an idyllic childhood by any stretch, but it was ours, and we made the best of it. So, when Curtis came to me one afternoon, about 6 years ago, asking to borrow $30,000, I didn't think twice. He told me he had a plan, an investment in a friend's construction business that promised to triple his money in just 3 years. Maybe if we'd grown up differently, with more financial security, I would have been suspicious, or at least a little cautious. But I'd finally found a stable job, had some money saved, and wanted to see my brother succeed. To me, it sounded like a chance to help him get ahead. I gave him the money without any formal paperwork because a handshake, a promise, and the bond of siblings felt more binding than ink on a contract. I still remember the light in his eyes when I handed him the check. He babbled about how it would change his life, about how grateful he was, how he would pay me back as soon as everything clicked into place. I didn't ask to see his friend's business plan, nor did I demand any collateral. I trusted him, simply because he was Curtis. We came from the same house with the same peeling wallpaper, the same backyard we once used for burying old toys, and I believe that kind of upbringing fostered an unbreakable trust. A year passed, and my life got hectic. I was adjusting to my new role as a mid-level manager at the insurance company where I worked, trying to prove myself, trying to accumulate enough paid time off for a real vacation. I'd check in on Curtis sporadically, and each time, he'd tell me everything was moving along as planned. My parents moved to Florida and left us alone in our original hometown. I'd call them on weekends and tell them that Curtis and I were doing just fine up north. On the surface, everything was normal. Underneath, I was starting to sense that maybe I'd been overly trusting. I didn't see any tangible signs of progress, no updates, no mention of the business. Curtis would just say, "Don't worry, I'll get you your money soon, then we can celebrate." That second year, I started asking a few pointed questions. Where was the construction site located? Could I see pictures of the progress? Every time I asked, Curtis changed the topic. He'd ramble about the cost of materials, the unpredictability of weather, or his partner's short-term cash flow issues. But he never offered proof. I told myself he was simply busy or a bit scatterbrained. I'd always known him to be the kind who lost his keys every other day, or who once forgot to pay our electric bill back when we were roommates in college. Still, the seed of worry had been planted, and it was slowly sprouting into a gnawing suspicion. At the 2.5-year mark, I pressed harder. $30,000 wasn't chump change, and I hadn't heard a single word about any returns. I called Curtis one night, and he let it go to voicemail. When he finally got back to me 2 days later, he sounded rattled and deflated. He said something had gone wrong with the investment, but it wasn't his fault. His friend had run off, or maybe the friend's partner had. The details were fuzzy. He promised he'd figure something out, said I just had to trust him a bit longer. I asked him outright, "Curtis, are you lying to me?" He got quiet, then launched into a tirade about how I was insulting him, how I should give him the benefit of the doubt, how he'd never do anything to hurt his only sibling. It was a solid performance. He almost convinced me. But my gut was telling me that not all was right in his world. I started watching him more closely. Since we lived only an hour apart, I'd sometimes drive by his apartment complex. I noticed he wasn't driving the same beater car he'd had for years. Instead, I saw a new SUV parked in his spot, tinted windows and black rims that looked far too expensive for someone lamenting a lost business venture. And whenever I visited his social media pages, I'd see pictures that didn't align with his story of hardship. Weekend ski trips, fancy dinners, new designer clothes. There was no mention of a failed investment or a missing business partner. He was out there living it up. Still, I tried to reason with myself. Maybe he'd gotten a new job, or maybe the construction business was actually working out. Maybe he was earning enough to splurge a little. I pushed down my doubts and waited for him to do the right thing. The official 3-year mark arrived, and he still owed me every cent. I called him, expecting him to at least acknowledge the date, but he brushed me off with vague excuses. I brought up the fact that he'd promised me repayment by now, but he only said, "We'll get it sorted eventually." Then he had the audacity to call it ancient history. That phrase cut me deeper than any insult he could have hurled. Ancient history? $30,000 was still gone from my bank account, and he was telling me to forget about it because it was old news? I slammed the phone down, seething. It was that moment when my loyalty to him began to erode, replaced by anger and a cold determination to get to the truth. Later that month, I discovered, through an old college friend, that Curtis had been boasting online about a luxurious vacation to Greece, complete with 5-star accommodations and private beach dinners. I almost dropped my phone when I saw the photos. He was standing on the deck of a rented yacht, sipping champagne with a few people I didn't recognize. The caption read, "Life is too short not to explore the world in style." The rage that pulsed through me felt so intense, I had to step outside to cool off. Here I was, clipping coupons and driving an aging sedan, all the while he was living a life of indulgence financed, at least in part, by my savings. I confronted him at a family gathering shortly after. It was the first time our parents had come up from Florida in a year, and we were all meeting at our aunt's place for a barbecue. It was supposed to be a day of relaxation, but I couldn't hold in my frustration. As soon as I saw him joking with our cousins, I pulled him aside and demanded answers. Curtis's face fell when he realized I wasn't going to drop the subject. He tried to pivot, to crack a joke about some marinade recipe, but I wasn't playing along. I recall my exact words. "Why are you vacationing on yachts while I'm still waiting to see a single dollar of that 30 grand I loaned you?" He turned red, stammered, then muttered something about having other financial resources. He shot me a glare that silently pleaded with me not to ruin the day in front of our whole extended family. I kept my voice low, but my frustration was obvious. I asked him again about the investment, about where my money truly had gone. He wouldn't look me in the eye. Eventually, he lashed out, telling me I was being petty. "Why do you always act like the world owes you something?" he sneered. The words stung. All I wanted was the money he'd promised to return. My parents, picking up on the tension, pulled me away and asked what was wrong. I told them everything, from the initial loan to the lavish vacations. My mother went pale, and my father's jaw clenched so hard I thought he might crack a tooth. They demanded Curtis come clean. He insisted he had it under control, that it was nobody's business but his and mine. The barbecue ended on a sour note, and the ride home was filled with strained silence. Over the next year, my resentment grew. Curtis seemed to be thriving, posting photos from a Caribbean getaway, then a ski trip in Colorado, then a music festival on the West Coast. No matter how many times I asked him to repay me, he'd either brush me off with claims that he was working on it, or scold me for harping on ancient history. We stopped having civil conversations. If we had to see each other at some holiday function, we'd avoid direct contact. My parents would look at me with sympathetic eyes, apologizing on his behalf, but they never forced him to act. He was their golden boy, after all, the younger sibling who always knew how to charm them. I tried to move on, but the bitterness was like a slow poison, seeping into every aspect of my life. I was never broke, but it hurt to see my finances set back by so many years of saving, especially when the beneficiary acted as though I was the one inconveniencing him. Then, out of nowhere, everything changed. I was at home on a Saturday morning, scrolling through social media, when I saw a local news article shared by a friend. It mentioned the arrest of several individuals in a suspected large-scale fraud scheme involving fake business investments, charitable front organizations, and embezzled funds. I nearly dropped my phone when I saw Curtis's name listed among the suspects. The article was light on details, but it spelled out that Curtis and 3 others were accused of conning multiple victims by promising lucrative returns on non-existent business ventures. My mind immediately went to the money I'd given him. I felt a swirl of conflicting emotions, anger, betrayal, a strange pang of pity. Could I have been one of his first victims? Or was I just the easiest mark, being his sister? I wondered if I should call him, but I hesitated. The same day, I got a frantic call from my mother, who said the police had come by looking for Curtis. She was in hysterics, convinced there must be some misunderstanding. She asked me over and over, could he really be mixed up in something like this? I didn't know how to answer. The rational part of me said yes, of course he could. The evidence was staring me in the face. The secrecy around my money, the lavish lifestyle, the distant attitude. But still, a part of me recalled that sweet little boy who once defended me from a bully in 5th grade. It was disorienting to realize he might have become a full-fledged criminal. That night, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I answered, and it was Curtis. His voice cracked with desperation. He said he was in trouble, that the cops were after him, that everything I'd seen online was a lie perpetuated by shady associates who dragged him into their scheme. I didn't believe him for a second, but I kept listening, unsure of how he'd gotten my number if he was supposedly hiding from the authorities. He tried to evoke our childhood bond, mentioning our late grandmother who always told us to look after each other. Then he dropped a bombshell. I need your help, and I need your forgiveness. The nerve of him. I wanted to scream that he'd had countless opportunities to come clean, to make it right, and he'd chosen instead to flaunt expensive vacations. But instead, I kept quiet, letting him ramble. He told me he feared going to prison, that they'd frozen some of his assets, and that he had nowhere else to turn. He was practically begging. I told him I couldn't speak with him anymore unless he was ready to be honest. And if he truly wanted help, I needed the truth about what he'd done with my money. It was a harsh ultimatum, but I felt he'd left me no choice. He started sobbing, claiming he couldn't talk freely on the phone, that he'd come to see me in person if I just told him where to meet. I was torn. Part of me wanted to hang up and never look back. Another part, the big sister in me, wanted to at least hear him out in person, if only for my own sense of closure. After a sleepless night, I decided I'd meet him at a quiet park on the outskirts of town, where we often went as kids to feed the ducks with stale bread. It felt symbolic, a place where we once laughed and confided in each other before life got complicated. I arrived the next afternoon, scanning the area for any sign of him. I saw him hunched over on a bench by the small pond wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He looked up when he heard me approach, and I was struck by how different he seemed. Gone was the easy confidence and cocky grin. He looked pale, exhausted, desperate. He talked in circles for nearly an hour, alternating between apologies and denials. Finally, I lost my patience. "Curtis," I said, "why did you take my money and never return it? Start with that." For a moment, I thought he might storm off or hurl an insult, but his shoulders sagged instead, and he began to explain. He admitted that from the very start, the construction investment was a ruse. He claimed he was in over his head with some gambling debts, and the easiest way to raise quick cash was to ask me, the sibling he knew would never refuse. He said that once he had my money, he realized it wouldn't even scratch the surface of what he owed certain people, so he got involved in a fraudulent investment ring with 2 shady acquaintances. The scheme paid off big in the beginning, allowing him to live like a king. But eventually, the authorities caught wind, and his world came crashing down. "I'm sorry," he kept saying, voice trembling. "I never wanted to hurt you." I stood there, feeling equal parts furious and sick to my stomach. I demanded to know if I was implicated in his crimes, if my money had been used to hurt anyone else. He assured me I was just another victim, that the authorities weren't going to come after me because I hadn't been part of the conspiracy. But he also said he had no way to repay me now. His accounts were frozen, and the courts were likely to seize anything he had left. I felt tears burn in my eyes, not because I was losing the money all over again, but because of this toxic mixture of rage and heartbreak that churned inside me. He wasn't just some random con artist, he was my baby brother. He asked me to talk to the police on his behalf, to tell them he was a decent guy who'd made a mistake. I laughed bitterly at his request. After all he'd put me through, after lying to my face for years, it was galling that he expected me to vouch for him now. I told him he needed to hire a lawyer, face the charges, and deal with the consequences of his actions. He pleaded, begging me to do something, anything. He even tried to guilt-trip me by asking if I really wanted to see my brother locked away, but I stood firm. I said, "You made this bed, Curtis. Now you have to lie in it." And with that, I walked away, leaving him on the bench with tears in his eyes. The next few weeks were a blur of news reports, legal updates, and frantic phone calls from our parents. They'd hired a defense attorney for him at considerable expense, and they were heartbroken at the idea of their son going to prison. Our father asked me to make a statement about Curtis's character. Our mother sobbed on the phone, saying that if he got sentenced, he might be behind bars for years, possibly a decade. I wrestled with my conscience. I still had lingering loyalty to the kid who once made me a birthday card by hand. But the adult he'd become had lied and stolen from me without remorse. Eventually, I decided that I wouldn't lie to help him. If the court asked me for facts, I'd give them the truth, nothing more and nothing less. During the trial, I sat in the back, uncertain if he even wanted me there. I felt a pang in my chest when I saw him wearing that ill-fitting suit, his hair disheveled, glancing nervously around the courtroom. His lawyer tried to paint him as a naive pawn, manipulated by more experienced criminals. The prosecution argued that he'd been a willing participant, spending the stolen funds on lavish trips and expensive items. When they read aloud the list of extravagant expenses, it was hard not to let my face twist in anger. My money had financed part of that spree, though I was hardly the only one conned by him. Curtis's accomplices testified against him, each trying to secure a lighter sentence by casting him as the ringleader. My parents wilted in their seats, looking older than I'd ever seen them. I couldn't tell if Curtis was telling the whole truth. He looked pitiful, like a drowning man trying to grab at any floating piece of debris. Part of me ached for him, yet I also felt a harsh satisfaction. He had to answer for his actions, just as anyone else would. When it was my turn to speak, I walked to the witness stand, knees trembling. I had to explain the loan, how he never repaid me, and how he'd boasted about trips I knew he couldn't afford. I didn't embellish, but I didn't hold back either. Curtis wouldn't look at me. His eyes were on the table, his lips pressed together in a grim line. I ended my statement by saying, "He's my brother and I love him, but he lied to me and stole from me. I can't ignore that." At the sentencing, the judge was scathing. He called their actions brazen and cruel. Curtis got 5 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 3. His accomplices got varied sentences based on their level of involvement, but Curtis was singled out for his role in soliciting money from family members under false pretenses. My parents wept. I stayed stoic, remembering how many nights I'd lost sleep over that money, how many times he'd lied to my face. After the sentence was handed down, he was allowed a moment to address the court. Curtis stood, voice shaking, and apologized to the victims. He glanced in my direction and said, "Especially my sister," before guards escorted him away. I was too drained to feel anything but a hollow pang of pity. I didn't see him again in person for nearly a year. I concentrated on moving forward, focusing on my career, my relationship with my boyfriend, and the small house I'd finally managed to buy. $30,000 was still gone, but I was working toward replenishing my savings. I did get the occasional letter from him, mostly full of apologies that sounded rehearsed, and pleas for me to visit. For the longest time, I didn't respond. I wasn't sure what to say. I couldn't forgive him yet. I wasn't even sure if I'd ever be able to. My parents visited him monthly, though they tried not to press me on doing the same. They understood I needed time. Then, on a cool autumn day, I found an envelope in my mailbox with shaky handwriting. I recognized Curtis's scrawl immediately. Inside was a letter different from the others. Instead of apologies and excuses, it was a detailed confession of regret. He admitted how wrong he was, that he had no right to use me as a safety net. He said the emptiness he felt behind bars was crushing, and that the guilt he carried for betraying me was almost unbearable. Reading his words brought tears to my eyes. I wasn't ready to forget the damage he'd done, but I realized something. He was human, deeply flawed, and suffering the consequences of his choices. I wrote back a short note that simply said, "I'm not ready to forgive you entirely, but I acknowledge your words. Take care of yourself." Over time, letters bounced back and forth. We began exchanging small pieces of our daily lives, sometimes reminiscing about our childhood. My guard was still up, but I felt a subtle shift in my emotions. I recognized that he was paying for what he'd done. Whether he truly deserved my forgiveness was a separate question, but I could at least attempt some form of communication that wasn't laced with bitterness. My parents expressed relief that we were in contact, though they never pestered me to expedite the healing process. When he was finally granted parole after 3 years, I received a call from my mother, who was overjoyed. She said he'd be staying at their place in Florida until he got back on his feet. She asked if I'd come for a family dinner to welcome him home, but I declined. I didn't want the moment he stepped out of prison to be the same moment I saw him face to face again. I needed him to settle into life outside, to grapple with the reality of the world he'd turned his back on, to maybe find a job or take steps toward redemption. I still had the right to protect myself. If he was truly remorseful, he'd understand. That Christmas, he sent me a card, along with a small check for $500. It felt like a fraction of what he owed, but the gesture was significant. Inside the card, he wrote, "I know this doesn't even begin to cover what I took from you, but please accept it as a sign that I'm trying. Someday, I'll make it right." That small amount of money stirred a myriad of feelings in me. Part of me wanted to rip the check to shreds, outraged at how pathetic it seemed in comparison to the original sum. But I didn't. I deposited it, letting myself believe it was a start. Eventually, I agreed to a face-to-face meeting in Florida. I flew down the following spring, taking a few days off work to see my parents, not entirely sure if I was ready to see Curtis. But the morning after I arrived, I found him sitting in the backyard under a palm tree, nervously fiddling with his hands. He looked thinner, older, a man who had seen the inside of a cell and been humbled by it. He rose as soon as he saw me, tears forming in his eyes. I stood there, arms folded, heart pounding. There was a long, uncomfortable silence before he said, "I'm sorry," voice trembling. "I know I can't erase the past, but I will try every day to be better." I looked away, trying not to cry. Then we talked, quietly and haltingly, for hours. He told me about the prison counselor who helped him address his gambling addiction, about the nightmares he still had of being locked up, about how he understood he'd lost my trust. I didn't promise him that everything was fine, but I did tell him I was willing to see if we could mend, step by step. We ended that conversation with a tentative hug, awkward and stiff, but filled with earnest hope. Months passed, and the updates I got from my parents suggested Curtis was serious about staying on the right path. He found a job at a local landscaping company. He set up a small automatic payment to my bank account, just $50 a month at first, but it was something. I was under no illusions that it would ever fully repay the $30,000, but maybe it was enough for me to learn how to let go of the anger that had festered. Our relationship would never return to the pure innocence of childhood, but maybe it didn't have to. Maybe we could find a new baseline, one shaped by honesty, however painful it might be. The end of the story, if there even is an end, came the day he texted me a photo of an empty piggy bank with a little note that read, "One day at a time." It was a humble image, but it moved me. I realized this was a journey that would unfold over years, maybe even decades. There was no sudden, dramatic resolution, no final reckoning that would undo the past. We were siblings bound by blood and history, carrying scars that would never fully fade. That photo represented something fragile yet promising, the possibility of genuine remorse met with cautious acceptance. Looking back, the unexpected twist wasn't that he went to prison or that he eventually tried to repay me. The real shock was realizing how complicated love and loyalty become when tested by betrayal. I used to think forgiveness was a one-time deal, a switch you flip, a moment of absolution. But it isn't. It's a gradual, uneven process that sometimes takes years and is never guaranteed. I haven't fully forgiven him, and he hasn't fully redeemed himself. But we're both trying in our own imperfect ways. In the quiet moments, I still grieve for the relationship we once had, for the trust that seemed so unshakable in our youth. Yet, life moves on. I learned that trusting again isn't a sign of weakness, it's a sign of resilience. It means I'm not letting his mistakes define how I live or how I love. Sometimes, in my dreams, I see us as kids again, racing our bicycles down the block or pretending we were explorers in the backyard. When I wake, I feel a pang of regret that those simpler days are gone forever. But I also feel a softness in my chest, a reminder that even broken bonds can be mended in small, uncertain steps. People often expect a neat ending to stories like ours, but real life isn't neat. It's messy, painful, and sometimes downright astonishing in how it unfolds. Curtis will live with the stain of his actions, and I'll live with the memory of his betrayal. Yet here we both are, taking small, wobbly steps towards something that resembles a new beginning. I don't know if he'll ever pay back every cent. I don't know if he'll fully conquer his demons. But I do know that despite everything, I choose to keep some space in my heart open to the possibility of healing. As for the money, I've learned to see it as a painful but potent lesson. Trust may be given freely, but once broken, it takes far more than words to rebuild. In some ways, that $30,000 bought me insight into who my brother truly was, and who he could still become. Even if it was the costliest lesson of my life, it wasn't entirely in vain. And so, the story remains open-ended. Curtis calls me once a week now, and we talk about mundane things, the weather, sports, our parents' health. Sometimes we talk about his struggles adapting to life outside of prison, the temptations he still faces, the guilt he can't quite shake. Other times, we laugh at a random childhood memory. With each conversation, we take a minuscule step away from the past and into an uncertain future. In a way, that uncertainty is our best hope. It means we haven't closed the door on each other, and maybe, someday, we can stand side by side as siblings who endured something devastating, but still refuse to let it define us completely. The real ending is that there is no definitive ending, just life continuing. It's not the neatly packaged conclusion I once craved, the kind where he hands me a check, apologizes, and we hug it out. Instead, it's a daily act of choosing to believe that people can change, that relationships can evolve, and that sometimes forgiveness isn't about letting the other person off the hook. It's about freeing yourself from the weight of perpetual anger. If that journey leads us to a place of genuine reconciliation, then the cost, though steep, might be worth it in the end. I don't know when I realized that my life was drifting toward chaos, but it must have been the day Lena marched into my office with a manila folder labeled financial documents. The instant I saw her pale face and furious eyes, my stomach clenched. Our breakup had been anything but amicable, but I'd never expected her to storm in where I worked, especially unannounced. She brushed past my stunned coworker, ignoring his attempts to stop her, and slammed that folder onto my desk. I was so rattled by her sudden presence that it took me a moment to get out of my chair. She glared at me, tears brimming, and said in a low voice that carried more weight than her usual melodrama, "You owe me child support." My heart thundered so hard in my chest that for a moment I thought she might be able to hear it. Baffled, I mumbled something about how it had only been 6 months since we'd seen each other, and in that time, she had never said a word about being pregnant. She scoffed, looking more furious than ever, and slammed her fist on my desk. "Did you think I was just going to deal with it on my own?" she demanded. Her words hit me like a slap. I had no idea what to say. The glare of my coworker's eyes burned into my back, and I could feel the tension sizzling in the air. Everyone was trying to figure out whether to intervene or pretend they hadn't noticed the meltdown unfolding in front of them. Lena seemed unbothered by our audience. She was here to get a reaction and, more importantly, to serve me an ultimatum. And she'd chosen a very public stage to deliver it. Without hesitation, she continued. She flipped open the folder, revealing a barrage of paperwork, forms from the County Family Services office, her pay stubs, and hospital bills. My head spun. I glanced at the documents, struggling to piece together the timeline of her allegations. She claimed our final night together had been enough to conceive a child she said had been born a month earlier. She insisted I'd abandoned her and that she had no choice but to demand legal recourse. Every accusation made my skin prickle. My mind swarmed with memories, the arguments, the broken dishes, the sobbing phone calls at 3 a.m., and finally, the fragile truce we'd made when we split. But none of it included any hint of a pregnancy. Before I could form a coherent question, she pointed to the top page and hissed, "Sign this, acknowledge paternity, and start paying your share." I felt my world tilt. An uneasy silence spread across the office. I felt stares drilling into my back, but I couldn't peel my eyes off those forms. The lines were dense with legal jargon, but one sentence stood out. I was officially being named the father of her newborn son. If I signed those papers, I'd be on the hook for child support, probably for the next 18 years. Worse, I would be acknowledging a responsibility I had no evidence of beyond Lena's word. My gut twisted in knots. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the folder back toward her. "I'm not signing anything until there's a paternity test," I said. I tried to keep my voice steady, but each syllable cracked under my anxiety. Lena's lips curled in a sneer, and for a moment, I sensed we were heading down a road neither of us would survive unscathed. No turning back now. Truly. Lena's reaction was instant. She snatched the folder from my desk and stormed off, shouting over her shoulder that I'd regret my decision. The entire office was left buzzing in her wake, and I spent the rest of the day answering awkward questions. My boss gave me that tight-lipped look of concern, but I brushed it off with a vague explanation. When I finally got home, I replayed the incident in my head. The idea of being a father gnawed at me. If this child was really mine, I would step up. But something about Lena's sudden demands, her refusal to mention anything earlier, made me suspicious. Deep down, I sensed a trap. I didn't want to believe she'd lie about something so life-altering, but the alternative, that she'd hidden her pregnancy out of spite, seemed equally plausible. I decided to contact a lawyer. I couldn't sleep. Fear consumed me. Contacting a lawyer was the easy part. Dealing with my sister Clarissa was harder. She had always been protective of me, or so I thought. When I told her about the paternity test, she surprised me by reacting with anger. "How could you question Lena like that?" she demanded, as though I were accusing Lena of a vicious crime. I felt a flicker of confusion. Clarissa had never been particularly fond of Lena during our relationship. In fact, she used to point out every fault she could find in her, but now she was scolding me for daring to doubt Lena's claim. That conversation ended abruptly, with Clarissa hanging up on me. I blamed her outburst on stress, never imagining the deeper reasons behind her reaction. Even so, I pushed forward, determined to protect myself from a potential scam. My lawyer filed the paperwork requesting a DNA test. Felt surreal. In the weeks that followed, Lena became increasingly hostile. She left voicemails at odd hours, alternately sobbing and raging. My phone would light up at midnight with messages accusing me of shirking my responsibilities, then shift to tearful pleas about how I was failing her and the baby. I tried not to engage. Everything was in the hands of the court, pending that DNA test. Meanwhile, I noticed Clarissa had grown cold toward me. Whenever I tried to talk to her, she said she was busy or shut me down with one-word answers. I couldn't figure out why she seemed to be siding with Lena, though they'd never been close. My mother brushed it off as a misunderstanding, urging me to stay calm and let the legal system handle everything. But a nagging feeling in my gut told me there was more to Clarissa's shift in loyalty, feared her betrayal. I finally confronted Clarissa one Sunday afternoon. She answered her door reluctantly, as if bracing herself for a lecture. Her eyes darted to the side, and I caught a glimpse of Lena's purse hanging on the coat rack. My stomach did a flip. "Is Lena here?" I asked, failing to mask my surprise. Clarissa nodded stiffly, her expression unreadable. Before I could press for answers, Lena emerged from the living room. She gave me a bitter smile and crossed her arms. Seeing her in my sister's home felt like stepping into an alternate universe. Clarissa mumbled something about them needing to talk privately, and I followed them into the kitchen. The tension in the room was suffocating. Lena's gaze flicked between Clarissa and me with a strange smugness, as though she held some secret I wasn't privy to. My chest constricted with a sense of impending doom. I could breathe. Clarissa cleared her throat, her gaze fixed on a random tile on the floor. "I think you two need to sort this out," she said quietly. It sounded rehearsed, as though Lena had choreographed the moment. Lena let out a sharp laugh. "What's there to sort out? He's the father. He's just refusing to do right by his child." My sister winced at the words but didn't correct her. I felt my temper flare, and I turned to Clarissa, demanding to know why she believed Lena so blindly. Her face turned red, and she sputtered something incoherent before finally blurting out, "She's not lying. I know it." Something about the way she said it made the hairs on my neck stand up. A swirl of confusion and anger churned in my gut. Why was Clarissa so certain? Was there a reason she wasn't telling me? My mind reeled uncontrollably then. My head pounded as Lena declared she had nothing else to say. She shoved past me, presumably heading toward the front door. But then I heard her footsteps pause. Clarissa looked panicked, as though caught between the two of us. Moments later, Lena returned with a sly grin stretching across her face. In her hand, she held a small envelope. She waved it in front of me. "If you don't believe me, just wait for the court-ordered test," she sneered, her gaze darting to Clarissa for a fraction of a second. Then she tossed the envelope onto the table. "Maybe you'll learn something new about your precious sister," she added in a whisper that made my blood run cold. With that, she left. The silence that followed was so thick it felt suffocating. Clarissa stared at the envelope as though it might explode at any moment. I dreaded its contents. Clarissa refused to open the envelope and insisted I leave. She practically shoved me out the door, muttering that this whole situation had become too much for her. I tried to reason with her, but she was in no mood for discussion. Returning to my apartment that night, I paced the living room, replaying the afternoon in my head. My sister had never been secretive. She was the type to wear her heart on her sleeve, but now she was hiding something, and it was connected to Lena. The next few days passed in a blur of tension. Lena flooded my voicemail with more accusations, and Clarissa dodged every single one of my calls. I spent hours in my lawyer's office, reaffirming that I would only comply with court orders once the DNA test was complete. Each day felt like a countdown to an inevitable, explosive revelation. I braced myself. Eventually, a court date was set for the DNA test. I arrived at the clinic early, my nerves frayed by a sleepless night. Lena showed up late, cradling a small bundle in her arms. The baby was tiny, eyes wide and curious. A wave of emotion nearly knocked me over. Could this really be my child? I'd been so resolute in my doubts, but holding the possibility in my mind was overwhelming. Lena, of course, used my hesitation against me. She shot me a triumphant look, as if to say, "See, you're already attached." We were both swabbed, as was the baby, under the supervision of a nurse. The entire process took less than half an hour, but it felt like a lifetime. When it was over, Lena left without a word. I stood there, feeling hollow and uncertain, waiting for the truth to finally emerge. Dread twisted my chest. Days turned into an excruciating week as I awaited the results. My lawyer assured me the lab would expedite the process, but each hour felt like an eternity. On the sixth day, a thick envelope arrived by certified mail. My hands trembled as I ripped it open. The official letter confirmed what I'd begun to suspect. The baby was not mine. I read the result 3 times, my eyes blurring with relief and a strange sense of betrayal. Relief because I wasn't responsible for a child sprung upon me without warning. Betrayal because Lena had lied to me so fervently. But there was another emotion lurking beneath the surface: dread. What would Lena do now that her ruse had been exposed? And how would Clarissa explain her unwavering support for Lena's deception? My phone buzzed on the table, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. The caller ID read unknown. It was Clarissa. She spoke in a shaky whisper, as though she feared being overheard. "I need to see you," she said. "There's so much you don't understand." My first instinct was to lash out, to demand why she'd helped Lena perpetuate this lie. But something in my sister's voice stopped me. I heard genuine fear. We agreed to meet at a deserted park on the outskirts of town. When I arrived, Clarissa was sitting on a bench, her hood pulled low over her face. She looked up at me with tear-stained eyes. Without any prodding, she began to explain. It turned out Clarissa had been in deep financial trouble: student loans, credit card debt. Lena had offered her money to convince me of paternity, hoping to speed along the process of establishing child support. My stomach churned as I realized the depths of Lena's manipulation. I felt so sick inside. Clarissa sobbed as she recounted her desperation. She claimed she had no idea Lena was lying about the child's parentage initially, only that Lena had dangled the promise of paying off a sizable chunk of her debts if she helped pressure me. By the time Clarissa realized the full extent of the lie, she felt trapped. She had already accepted some of the money, and she feared Lena would turn on her if she backed out. The revelation hit me like a train. I wanted to be furious with my sister, but her brokenness was palpable. She apologized over and over, insisting she'd been planning to tell me sooner but couldn't work up the courage. My anger didn't vanish, but a reluctant sympathy arose within me. We sat there for a long time, the chill in the air matching the cold reality of Lena's manipulative scheme. I shivered, feeling utterly betrayed. With the DNA results officially clearing me, I assumed Lena would drop her pursuit. Instead, she doubled down, accusing me of falsifying the test. Her social media exploded with vitriol aimed at me. She posted pictures of the baby, complete with heart-wrenching captions about an absent father. My coworkers caught wind, and soon I was the subject of rampant gossip. The situation spiraled further when Lena filed a lawsuit claiming I had emotionally abused her and was refusing to support our child. My lawyer assured me the DNA test results would invalidate her claims, yet the damage to my reputation was significant. Friends started distancing themselves, unsure how to navigate the drama. Even my boss called me into his office, inquiring if I needed time off. I felt cornered, my attempts to clear my name drowned out by the noise of Lena's relentless campaign. Everything felt bleak and suffocating. Truly, Clarissa tried to help me by publicly admitting she had colluded with Lena under false pretenses, but her confession went largely ignored in the chaos. Lena used her platform to label Clarissa a traitor, claiming she was only trying to save her own skin. Meanwhile, I dug up every piece of evidence I could to demonstrate the falsity of Lena's claims. Emails, text messages, even receipts showing that I'd had no contact with Lena during the period she claimed we'd conceived. It felt like swimming against an endless tide. The more I tried to set the record straight, the more I seemed to be drowning in accusations. Family gatherings became tense. Some relatives believed me, others took Lena's side, claiming I was using my financial stability to intimidate her. In truth, I felt anything but stable. My world was on the brink of collapse. Hope seemed distant, almost imaginary. Truly, the lawsuit hearing arrived, and I entered the courtroom feeling both anxious and angry. My lawyer presented the DNA test results immediately, which the judge acknowledged but insisted on reviewing alongside Lena's allegations. Lena took the stand, recounting tearful stories of how I allegedly abandoned her during her pregnancy. She painted a picture of a manipulative, cold-hearted partner who left her alone in her darkest hour. Despite the test proving I wasn't the father, she maintained I had some moral obligation to help her. My blood boiled, but I contained myself. When Clarissa testified, she recounted the bribe Lena had offered her, detailing how she had been coerced into supporting Lena's narrative. Still, Lena clung to her story, claiming I manipulated the test and threatened Clarissa. The judge reserved judgment for a later date, leaving me stuck in legal limbo with my reputation further battered. I felt utterly powerless again. In the aftermath, I retreated from social media and surrounded myself with people who still believed in me. Clarissa stayed close, determined to make amends, though our relationship remained strained. Late one night, she showed me a recorded voicemail Lena had left her. In it, Lena threatened to expose Clarissa's financial desperation if she didn't keep supporting the false paternity claim. That message was the final nail in the coffin of Lena's credibility. I handed the recording over to my lawyer immediately. He assured me it would devastate Lena's case. The next hearing couldn't come soon enough. I arrived at the courthouse with a grim sense of anticipation. Lena was there, but she looked shaken. When my lawyer played the voicemail for the judge, you could have heard a pin drop. Lena's face turned ashen, and her bravado seemed to evaporate in an instant. A hush blanketed the courtroom abruptly. With the voicemail as evidence, the judge dismissed Lena's lawsuit and admonished her for misleading the court. My reputation wasn't instantly repaired, but a weight lifted from my shoulders. In the days that followed, Lena vanished from social media, and rumors circulated that she'd moved out of state. As for Clarissa, our bond is still mending, one difficult conversation at a time. Though I resent her initial betrayal, I've come to understand her desperation. Nobody emerged from this ordeal unscathed. Even so, I've started reclaiming my life step by step. My boss eventually offered an apology for doubting me, and a handful of friends who had distanced themselves have reached out. The experience changed me. I'm more wary, more guarded, yet I refuse to let bitterness define my future. The twisted saga ended not with a triumphant victory, but with a cautious relief and a hard-earned lesson. Hope lingered, quietly waiting. My parents are forcing me out after surgery, left me blind. My sister is coming home and doesn't want me there. I remember the swirl of colors that last morning I woke up able to see. The sunlight through my curtains painted orange stripes across my bed, and I had this fleeting sense that everything was exactly as it should be. I was 19, full of plans, and convinced that my future lay at my feet. The doctors had scheduled my surgery for the following week, promising a high likelihood of success. That phrase echoed in my head repeatedly, like a lullaby I desperately wanted to believe. High likelihood was not a guarantee, but I clung to hope. My mother's voice rang in my ears, urging me to trust the medical experts, to remain calm, to imagine a triumphant story I could retell for years. My father, more stoic, only nodded when I shared my fears. In the hush between their reassurances, I felt a strange dread settling. Maybe it was the final morning light I'd ever see. Everything might change in ways I couldn't predict. Yet I refused to give in to fear. Life felt too fragile to handle alone, but I trusted my family to be my anchor. I had no clue how unsteady they would prove to be. The surgery itself was meant to remove a benign tumor pressing against my optic nerves, but something went wrong in the operating room. I woke up in dimness that refused to sharpen. My first thought was that the anesthesia hadn't fully worn off. Then realization sank in, slow and suffocating. The world I'd known was gone. Panic swelled in me like a physical force, and I cried out for someone to help me. Doctors and nurses tried to soothe me with quiet voices. They urged patience, offered optimism, recommended follow-up tests. My parents hovered, each clutching one of my hands. I heard hushed whispers between them, the grim worry they couldn't hide. When the specialists finally confirmed that my eyesight wouldn't return, I felt like I was sinking into quicksand. There was no going back. My mother told me we would adapt together, but her voice shook. It was a promise I believed in wholeheartedly. Reality, however, would unravel that trust. Blindness was not just a medical condition. It became a spotlight on every hidden crack in my family's foundation. We were headed toward an earthquake I never saw coming, and part of me prayed this was some impossible nightmare. Recovery at home felt like entering a foreign country. Familiar rooms became minefields of sharp-edged furniture, loose rugs, and unpredictable corners. My mother arranged mobility lessons and braille training, but her patience was overshadowed by exasperation. My father helped where he could, quietly shifting chairs so I wouldn't trip, but he rarely spoke. I sensed his discomfort, as if my blindness was a misfortune he couldn't fix, so he refused to face it head-on. My sister Ava was away at college. Whenever she called, she sounded distracted, telling me to keep my spirits up. I smiled into the phone, wishing I could see her face. I worried about being a burden to everyone, but I also counted on their love. Weeks passed, and I learned to move through the house with some confidence, but the tension lay thick beneath the surface. My mother's sighs grew heavier, and my father retreated into longer silences. I pretended not to notice, determined to prove I still deserved a place at home. Deep down, though, I sensed that something was about to snap. Their carefully guarded frustration kept building, and I didn't realize how explosive it could become until the day Ava came home. She arrived earlier than planned, dragging a suitcase that thumped down the hallway. I listened from my bedroom, heart pounding. She breezed in with the same energetic aura I remembered, but something felt different. Her laughter was forced. Even before I heard the strained greetings in the kitchen, I sensed unease from the way she called my name. There was no warmth in that voice. "Are you doing okay?" she asked, stepping into my room. I nodded stiffly. She didn't hug me. Instead, she exhaled and said, "Mom and Dad think you need more care than we can give." I didn't want to agree, but they have a point. My throat tightened. "Ava, I just need time." She sighed heavily. "I brought my boyfriend with me, and we need space. You can't stay here forever." Her words hit like a slap. My sister, my lifelong ally, was telling me to leave. I swallowed a surge of despair, trying to keep my composure. "I understand," I whispered, but it felt like betrayal. The house I had fought to navigate suddenly seemed hostile. Every wall threatened to suffocate me. I wanted to scream, but all I managed was a weak nod goodbye. My parents broke the news that evening over dinner, though nobody truly ate. My father cleared his throat and said they had looked into assisted living options. My mother insisted I consider a specialized facility where professionals could help me adjust. Her tone was gentle, as if she didn't want me to understand the finality behind her words. "I can still learn to function here," I argued, my voice trembling. "I'm not helpless. Please, just give me a chance." My father quietly shook his head. I heard the scrape of his fork against the plate. Ava sat silent, perhaps regretting her blunt words earlier, or maybe just uncomfortable with this standoff. My mother repeated that it was for my own good, a phrase that made me grit my teeth. I realized they had planned this for weeks, waiting for Ava to return so they could finalize everything. Their betrayal stung, but beneath the anger I felt a hollow ache of fear. Where would I go? How would I manage alone? My family was shutting me out, and I had no backup plan. My appetite vanished, replaced by a numb resignation. I pushed my chair away from the table and fled. That night, I fumbled through my closet, packing blindly into a duffel bag. My hands shook on every shirt I folded, every pair of socks I tried to locate. Tears clung to my lashes, and I silently scolded myself for crying. I felt my mother linger in the doorway, her breath shallow. She offered hushed reassurances, but they fell flat. This was happening. There was no reversing their decision. In the kitchen, I overheard Ava telling her boyfriend she couldn't wait for some peace and quiet once I was gone. The knife of her indifference twisted deeper. I used to admire my sister's confidence, but now it felt like cruelty. Around midnight, I sank onto my bed, imagining the darkness swirling around me like a heavy fog. I pressed my palms against my eyes, half wishing I could wake up from this nightmare. My parents made it clear I was leaving in the morning. I didn't know how to survive beyond these walls, but they wouldn't offer me the choice to stay. My heartbeat roared in my ears. I felt abandoned, shattered, and angry. This was not the life I had imagined, yet it was the only one I had. Morning arrived with the sound of my father loading my duffel into the trunk. My mother hovered near the front door, offering me an envelope filled with cash. "For emergencies," she said quietly. Her voice trembled, but I could only manage a hollow thank you. Ava's boyfriend waited in the hallway, clearing his throat impatiently. My sister didn't come to say goodbye. The engine rumbled as my father drove me to a low-budget apartment complex run by a friend of his coworker. He said it would be a temporary arrangement. I felt the tension in his posture, the reluctance in his voice. He didn't want me with them, but he also hated this solution. We rode in strained silence until he parked. An unfamiliar hand guided me onto the sidewalk. I gripped my cane, counting steps to memorize distances. The manager handed me a key. My father murmured something about checking in. Then, as quickly as we arrived, he left. I stood alone in the dim corridor, counting my heartbeats. The emptiness inside me felt infinite. Part of me wanted to call out, to beg him not to go, but the door slammed, and I realized he was gone for good. At first, the apartment seemed like a prison cell, cramped and silent. Every footstep echoed, reminding me how alone I was. I spent hours just sitting on the couch, struggling not to think about what my family was doing without me. My phone stayed silent most days. Ava never called. My mother sent a single text that read, "Are you okay?" I didn't respond. If she needed to know, she'd have to come see for herself. Gradually, I forced myself into a routine. I practiced cooking simple meals, memorized the layout to avoid tripping, and slowly adapted to a life without sight. Small victories lifted my spirits, frying an egg without burning it, finding my way to the mailbox and back. Each success reminded me I could still function. Every evening, I imagined my sister in our old room, my parents watching television, normal and intact as if I never existed. Despite the ache, I persisted. Survival became my driving force. Blindness might confine my eyes, but it wouldn't break my will. Days turned into weeks, and though I struggled, I endured. Yet, somewhere in the shadows, a part of me still longed for home, for acceptance, for love lost. I was cleaning the kitchen one afternoon when a knock came at the door. My heart leapt, hoping foolishly it might be my parents, but it was Ava. She stood in awkward silence as I navigated toward her. "Why are you here?" I asked softly, struggling to keep my bitterness from surfacing. Her sigh fluttered across the entryway. "Mom told me you wouldn't answer her calls," Ava said. "I felt I had to check on you." I stayed quiet, uncertain how to respond. Her presence revived memories of childhood adventures, secrets we once shared, but the woman before me felt like a stranger. "I want to apologize," she continued. "I didn't mean for everything to go this way. I guess I was scared your blindness would hold us all back." My stomach twisted at her words. "You were scared? You can see," I muttered, anger bubbling beneath the surface. She stepped closer, voice trembling. "I know, and I'm sorry, but maybe we can fix this. Maybe you can come home." My pulse pounded. "They don't want me there." She hesitated, then whispered, "Things changed. Dad lost his job, and they're selling the house. He's angry and Mom's health is declining. Her confession rattled me more than I expected. They were struggling too, yet my anger refused to fade completely. I needed them, Ava. I needed you. She placed a tentative hand on my shoulder. I'm sorry, she repeated softly. I want to help, but I don't know how. My chest tightened. I don't think there's a quick fix for this, I admitted. We stood there, the gulf between us so vast I could sense it in the silence. Then she handed me a folded paper. It's from Mom, Ava said. Some letter she wrote you. My throat constricted. I took it gingerly, fingers tracing the creases. Will you read it to me? I whispered. She inhaled unsteadily and began. Dear child, I'm so sorry for pushing you away. I thought I was protecting us both from pain, but I see now you needed me more than ever. Please forgive me. I love you. Ava's voice broke on the last words. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I reached out, found her hand, and squeezed. We remained in that fragile embrace, both sensing that no simple apology could fix our fractured bond, but perhaps it was enough to begin. I remember the day my older sister Serena first discovered that Dad wasn't her biological father. We were both in college then, she a junior, I a freshman. She called me late at night, her voice trembling as she confessed that she'd rummaged through some of Mom's old documents in a desperate attempt to find her birth certificate. Instead, she found letters and hospital forms that revealed the truth. The man who'd raised her, who'd taught her to ride a bike and danced with her at her high school homecoming, wasn't related to her by blood. She cried so hard I could barely make out what she was saying. At first, I thought she had to be mistaken. Our dad, the same stoic man who had served in the Air Force and later opened a small hardware store, had never treated either of us differently. He didn't differentiate between his firstborn and his youngest. He took pride in our accomplishments equally. But Serena claimed she had confronted Mom, who broke down and admitted to having an affair in her 20s with a businessman passing through town. That man lived in California, and once the affair ended, Mom vowed to raise Serena as Dad's daughter and never speak of it again. In the weeks that followed, our family unraveled in slow motion. I drove home from my own campus one weekend to find Dad sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a stack of papers, while Mom hovered nearby, wringing her hands. He looked exhausted, as though he'd aged years in just days. He told me he had known Serena wasn't his child from the moment she was born. He'd figured it out when he overheard a hushed phone call Mom made late one night, and he later confirmed his suspicion through old hospital records. But he stayed because he loved Mom and believed he could still be a father to Serena. He wanted to give her a stable home, something he hadn't had growing up. I watched him fight back tears. It was one of the rare moments I saw his stoic facade crumble. Serena tried to continue life as usual for a while, but the weight of the secret changed her. Whenever she visited for holidays, she avoided Dad's eyes. She would retreat to her old bedroom early in the evening, claiming headaches or jet lag if she'd come in from college. I could sense her resentment toward both of our parents, toward Mom for lying, and toward Dad for letting her believe a version of reality that wasn't true. She never said it directly, but I knew part of her felt betrayed by the very man who had raised her with so much love. When she graduated, she stunned us by announcing she had tracked down her biological father in Santa Monica. His name was Raymond Saunders, and he was thrilled to learn that he had an adult daughter he'd never met. Within a few weeks, she made the decision to move to California for graduate school and to get to know him better. Dad gave her a long, quiet hug on her last day in our small Midwestern town. I don't think I've ever seen a sadder expression on his face. After she left, I tried to maintain some line of communication. I'd text her memes or silly pictures of the dog we'd had growing up, hoping to spark a bit of nostalgia. Sometimes she responded with a polite laugh or a quick, "Hope you're well," but mostly the silence stretched. From Mom and Dad's perspective, the house felt empty without Serena around. It wasn't that she had been some huge extrovert who filled the place with energy, but her absence was a constant reminder of the fracture that had formed between us all. Still, Dad never spoke ill of her. Even when Mom grew teary-eyed, calling Serena stubborn, Dad would quietly say, "She needs time." Yet, as the months turned into years, time felt like an excuse for the fact that we were hardly a family anymore. Eventually, I graduated from college and got a decent job in marketing a few towns over. Mom and Dad still lived in the old house where we grew up. Mom's health was fine, but Dad's started to falter in his early 60s. At first, it was just fatigue and some dizzy spells, but he was soon diagnosed with a serious heart condition. He had to retire from the hardware store, and I pitched in whenever I could. Since I lived close by, I'd often stop in after work to fix their leaky faucets or mow the lawn. Dad still never talked much about Serena, though I'd see the longing in his eyes whenever there was a commercial on TV about California beaches, or when he came across an old photo of her. Mom sometimes wrote letters to Serena, which she mailed to an address in Santa Monica. I doubted Serena wrote back because Mom would sigh and shake her head every time the mail arrived empty of any response. One day, as Dad's health worsened, he asked me to meet him at a local lawyer's office. That was the first time he brought up the possibility that he might not have long to live. He explained he wanted me to serve as the executor of his estate. He wasn't wealthy, just the house, the property, and a small pension from his years of service. It was enough to settle any debts and still leave me with a modest inheritance. I asked him if he wanted to include Serena in the will, because even though she wasn't biologically his child, she'd been his daughter in every sense until she found out the truth. He hesitated, closing his eyes. Finally, he admitted he felt it was her choice that severed the bond, not his. "She has someone else to call Dad now," he said, his voice strained. "I don't want to leave her nothing, but she never came back." I saw the heartbreak in his gaze. It wasn't until several weeks later that Serena reappeared, at least digitally. She sent me a text out of the blue, asking about Dad's condition. At first, I was relieved to hear from her. Maybe she had felt a pang of conscience and wanted to reconcile, but the conversation quickly shifted to talk of finances. Does he have a will? Is it official? Who's included? I tried not to jump to conclusions, but it stung to think her concern might be more about her share of any inheritance than about Dad's well-being. Nevertheless, I informed her of the truth. Dad was in poor shape, and I wasn't sure how long he had. I didn't mention the original draft of his will, the one excluding her entirely, but I said he was sorting out legal matters. A week later, she flew back into town. The moment she stepped off the plane and into my beat-up sedan, I noticed she looked sophisticated, polished even. She wore a designer coat, her hair perfectly styled, and her nails meticulously manicured. It felt surreal. The sister I remembered was the girl who wore hoodies and messy ponytails to class, complaining about the Midwest winters. I drove her to our parents' house without much conversation. When she walked into the living room, Dad was sitting in his recliner, reading a battered paperback. He glanced up, and for a second, I swore I saw his eyes light up. But then an awkward stiffness set in, like neither of them knew how to hug or say hello. Mom hovered in the background, tears glistening in her eyes. Serena offered a small hug, and Dad gently patted her back. Over the next few days, she stayed in her old bedroom. Little had changed except for the new bedding and some old boxes stacked in the corner. She tried to reconnect, asking Dad about his medications and what the doctors had said. She even joined Mom in the kitchen, relearning family recipes she hadn't touched in years. I wanted to believe this was sincere, but I caught her once on the phone, whispering about money and assets in the middle of the night. When I asked her about it the next morning, she brushed it off as just a conversation with her employer back in California. I wanted to give her the benefit of the doubt. Dad, meanwhile, started to soften. He recalled old memories at dinner, smiling as he told the story of teaching Serena how to tie her shoes, how she kept insisting on wearing mismatched socks. Serena listened, her face reflecting a complicated mix of nostalgia and regret. Not long after, she announced she had to fly back to California for a major real estate deal. She couldn't lose the opportunity, she said. Dad tried to hide his disappointment, but it was all over his face. He asked if she'd come back soon. She promised she would. Right before she left, Dad pulled me aside and said he wanted to revise his will. He wanted to leave half the house to her, half to me. He recognized he'd been angry before, but she was his daughter in all but blood, and he wasn't going to deny that love, no matter how she had hurt him. We both went to the lawyer the following week, signed everything, and it became official. Dad then told me he felt a sense of peace, like he'd made things right. As the months dragged on, Dad was in and out of the hospital. I'd text Serena updates, letting her know each time he took a turn for the worse. Sometimes she'd reply with a quick, "keep me posted," but other times she went silent. I'd see her social media posts showing her sitting poolside at fancy hotels or attending glamorous galas. Part of me felt furious that she wasn't rushing to be by his side, especially now that she knew she stood to inherit half of his estate. I wanted to call her out on it, but Dad always said not to. He maintained hope that she'd come when the time was right, that she just needed to settle her affairs in California. One cold November morning, Dad's heart finally gave out. Mom and I rushed to the hospital, only to find the bed empty. He'd passed minutes before we arrived. The nurse offered hushed condolences, and we stood in numb silence, grappling with a grief we'd expected, but still couldn't handle. I texted Serena the news. She responded a few hours later with, "I'm so sorry, I'll try to make it for the funeral." That word, try, echoed in my head all day. The funeral was set for a Thursday afternoon. Family friends, neighbors, and a few of Dad's Air Force buddies showed up. Mom cried softly beside me as we listened to the minister's eulogy. I kept scanning the crowd, expecting Serena's familiar face, but she never appeared. After the burial, when we returned to the house, a delivery van pulled up with flowers, a huge arrangement of white lilies signed, "With love, Serena." My heart twisted in a mess of anger and longing. No matter how beautiful the flowers were, they couldn't replace her presence. 2 days later, the lawyer called to set an appointment for the formal reading of Dad's will. I emailed Serena the details. She asked if we could postpone. She claimed she was swamped with a major closing on a luxury property. I was done waiting. We moved forward without her. Mom and I sat in the lawyer's office, flipping through pages that detailed Dad's final wishes. As expected, he left half the house to Serena, half to me. He also left a modest sum to Mom, tied up in life insurance and joint savings. At the end of the session, the lawyer handed me a sealed envelope labeled with Serena's name and said Dad had wanted her to have it. I held on to it, not sure when I'd get the chance to deliver it. A week passed before Serena finally arrived, dragging her rolling suitcase into my apartment. She looked frazzled this time, lacking her usual polish. I tried to be courteous, offered her tea, and told her we'd already gone through the will reading. Her eyes went wide with panic, but I assured her that Dad had left her exactly what he intended. She asked if there was anything else. Wordlessly, I handed her the sealed envelope. She locked herself in my bedroom to read it. Through the closed door, I heard muffled sobs. Eventually, she emerged, red-eyed, clutching the letter to her chest. She refused to show it to me but said Dad had written that he forgave her for leaving, forgave her for seeking out her biological father, and that all he ever wanted was for her to be happy. She asked if we could go to the old house to see Mom. The three of us ended up there that same night, rummaging through Dad's belongings in a shared haze of grief. We found a stack of photo albums buried in the closet, old Polaroids of him teaching Serena to fish in the creek, pictures of him pinning a corsage on her wrist before a school dance, images of him helping me build my first science fair project. Serena lingered over these photos, tears staining the plastic sleeves. For the first time since her return, I saw genuine remorse in her eyes. I asked if she had regrets, and she nodded vigorously, saying she wished she'd found a way to balance her need to know her biological father with her love for the man who raised her. There was a new vulnerability to her that I hadn't witnessed in years. Mom gave Serena Dad's old wedding ring, something he'd taken off once his fingers got too swollen. Mom said she wanted Serena to have it as a reminder that despite everything, he had chosen to stay in this family. Serena wept openly, and Mom wept with her. I stood there, uncertain of what I should do, until I felt them both pulling me into a hug. The moment felt surreal, as if the three of us were trying to hold on to each other for dear life, determined not to let another secret or betrayal shatter what remained of our family. Over the next several days, Serena and I took turns sifting through boxes in the attic. We found old letters Dad had written to Mom during his service, long sentimental passages about how he dreamed of building a life for us that was secure and full of love. We also found notes Dad had scribbled in a small journal, mentioning how he always worried Serena would hate him once she learned the truth. In one entry dated back to my senior year of high school, he wrote, "Sometimes love is about accepting that you don't get all of the credit. I only hope she sees my heart when all is said and done." That night, we cooked dinner in the outdated kitchen, the same place Dad used to flip pancakes on Sunday mornings. Mom sat at the table, telling us stories about the early years of marriage, how Dad had forgiven her but never truly let go of the pain. Serena was listening closely, tears filling her eyes every so often. I asked her if she planned to stay a while. She hesitated, glancing at her phone, which buzzed with what I assumed were work messages. Eventually, she admitted she couldn't stay indefinitely. She had responsibilities back on the West Coast, but she promised she would come back for Christmas, and I believed her this time. 2 nights before her scheduled departure, she pulled me aside. She confessed she wasn't doing as well in California as she'd let on. Raymond, her biological father, had gone through a nasty legal battle with former business partners and lost most of his capital. Her real estate career had plateaued when the market slowed, leaving her saddled with bills and debt. Part of why she'd rushed back was because she needed to secure her portion of Dad's estate. She hung her head, ashamed. She insisted she also wanted to reconcile, but financial desperation had loomed. My first instinct was anger, but I found myself recalling Dad's words about love being complicated, about how secrets poison relationships. I took a deep breath and told her that, if anything, I appreciated her honesty now. We could still figure out how to move forward as a family. On her final day in town, Serena and I drove to the cemetery to visit Dad's grave. The headstone was simple, adorned with a tiny Air Force insignia. We stood there in silence for a long time, letting the chilly wind rattle the skeletal branches overhead. Then Serena knelt down, placed a small photo of the two of them from her 10th birthday on the stone, and said, "Thank you for everything. I'm sorry it took me so long to come home." She sobbed in a way that suggested she might finally be letting go of the guilt and anger that had consumed her for years. When we got back to the car, I asked her if she planned to keep Dad's letter. She clutched it tightly and said she intended to frame it once she got back to Santa Monica. She also asked if I would consider coming out to visit sometime. "Raymond isn't the devil," she said quietly. "He just never had the chance to raise me, and I think I created this fantasy world where he'd make up for all that I was missing. It wasn't real, and by the time I realized that, I'd already burned so many bridges here." I nodded, thinking about how Dad's final act had been to leave her half of the house, even after everything. In that moment, it felt like the ultimate testament to his capacity for grace. The following morning, she packed her bags, gave Mom a prolonged hug, and even took time to sit with me on the back porch to watch the sun come up. Birds chirped in the early light, and the fence we used to climb as kids creaked in the breeze. Neither of us spoke for a while. Then she turned to me, tears in her eyes, and asked if I thought Dad had really forgiven her in the end. I told her I had no doubt about that he'd forgiven her before she even asked. She sighed, a mixture of relief and sorrow. "I don't deserve it," she whispered, and I gently reminded her that love is rarely about what we deserve. When Serena walked to the taxi, she paused at the door and looked back at Mom and me, standing on the front step. It felt like an old scene replaying with a different cast of emotions. This time, her eyes glistened not with anger but with a profound longing to remain connected. She waved goodbye, and something about that moment felt like a fragile new beginning. Dad was gone, yet in his last weeks, he had forced us to confront the lies and the guilt that had driven us apart. Now, we had to figure out how to rebuild without his steady presence. I closed the door, watching the taxi carry Serena away, and I realized that the unpredictability of life is sometimes the only constant. Dad's final choice to include Serena in the will might have seemed risky to anyone who thought she'd only come running for money, but it gave her the chance to discover the depth of his compassion. It also gave me the chance to learn that forgiveness can transcend even the cruelest disappointments. Our mother's missteps, Serena's departure, my own resentment, none of it had been erased, but it had been laid bare. We were starting fresh, scars and all. Weeks later, I received an envelope from Serena. Inside was a Polaroid of the two of us with Dad, taken the day I'd finally mastered riding a bike. On the back, she'd written, "I miss him every day. I love you, brother." For the first time since she left for California, I believed her words without hesitation. I placed the photo on the mantel beside Dad's folded American flag. As I stood there, I thought about how I couldn't predict what the future held for either of us. Yet, I felt hopeful that this time, we wouldn't let secrets or guilt drive us apart. Family was complicated, and always would be. But maybe, just maybe, we could carry Dad's lessons forward, never again allowing shame or resentment to overshadow the bonds we once believed were unbreakable. And in that small flicker of hope, I felt Dad's presence, quietly reminding me that real love can outlast even the most painful revelations.